Menhaden board meeting. 10-minute warning.
Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody. Is there an echo in here? In here? It's a nice and spacious space, don't you think? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Boyles. I'm chair of the Menhaden Management Board. I want to welcome everyone to the now modified, new and improved 2015 winter meeting. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the staff for finding this great new venue that seems to be a little bit more spacious and may tax my eyesight. Lewis, I think that's you back there, but and thank the commissioners for the efforts to get here, and certainly to our members, our constituents, and the public. Thank you for your forbearance as we've dealt with travel disruptions in the Northeast Corridor, but appreciate everybody's diligence in getting here. And with that, we will call to order the meeting of the Menhaden Management Board. First item on the agenda is seeking board consent for the approval of the agenda, which was sent out in the briefing materials. I know we've had a request to add an item by Ms. Fegley of Maryland on AP nominations. Is there any other items to add to the agenda? Seeing none, is there any objection to accepting that modified agenda with the addition of the AP nominations? Seeing none, the agenda stands approved as amended. Next, we will go way back to May of 2014 to look at our proceedings from our last meeting, the Menhaden Management Board. Again, those proceedings were sent out in the briefing materials. Any corrections, additions, deletions to those minutes? I see none. Any objection to accepting those minutes? I see none. Those minutes are approved. Next on the agenda is time for public comment from members of the public who wish to speak, who would like to address issues that are not on the agenda. We have had a request. Robert Brown from the Maryland Watermen's Association. Mr. Brown, if you could come up to the public mic and state your name for the record.
Hello. Good afternoon. I'm Robert T. Brown, President of the Maryland Watermen's Association.
Mr. Brown, would you pull that microphone down?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. Robert T. Brown, President of the Maryland Watermen's Association. And our fishery in the state of Maryland is primarily on Menhaden, a pound net fishery. They catch about 97% of the fish, or the Menhaden, which are harvested in the state of Maryland. It is a stationary object. We can't follow the fish. We have to wait for the fish to get us. Our fishermen over the past 2 years have had to deal with these harsh quotas that we have had, and it's been very hard on us, and it has also increased the price of bait to all the crabbers that we have in our state, and as far as it goes up north to lobstermen and everybody else. With the new data received by the technical committee, and in light of a new stock assessment, we're asking for a new consideration to reopen the Menhaden fishery, or at least relax what we have now to give us more fish so we can stay in business. It is a very expensive business to be into. What it costs with copper to paint the nets and everything else. I don't have to go into all those details. However, we do need relief on this. We would like to see it go back, because what it was all based on before we found out was not the true figures of the amount of fish that was out there. So if you could help us out with this, we'd appreciate it very much. Thank you. And is there any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to make a couple of comments. Those of us in New England are enjoying the results of the Super Bowl. I just wanted to pass on to our fellow commissioners in New York that now we know, as well as New York, what it feels like to win a Super Bowl in a fluke play.
And I'm supposed to follow that, right? Thank you. Any other public comments? All right, I see none. We will now move on to the agenda for presentations on the 2015 Atlantic Menhaden Stock Assessment Reports. First up is Amy Schuler to talk about presentation of the Stock Assessment Report. Amy, thank you.
Okay. As you guys know, we've been working on the stock assessment for quite some time, and you guys have received updates as we've been going through this process. And basically, I'm here to talk about the assessment itself, what changes have occurred since the last assessment, and the outcomes of this assessment. So here's my outline. The terms of reference that were tasked to the Stock Assessment Subcommittee, the data that were used for the assessment itself, and then major changes from that last assessment before I move into reference points and then future directions. Just keep in mind, this assessment was a back to the drawing board, consider every decision made. So we did make some, there are differences, and we'll get to that. So terms of reference for this assessment included reviewing and vetting all available data sources available, characterize the precision and accuracy of the data, develop a population assessment model or models compatible with the data, and analyze the performance, characterize uncertainty, perform retrospective analyses, and then recommend stock status, and if appropriate, recommend alternative reference points. The last three terms of reference were to identify potential ERPs, or ecological reference points, which Jay will be talking about next, and that's with respect to Atlantic menhaden's role as a forage fish. Then provide research recommendations to move forward on before the next assessment, and then recommend timing of the next assessment. And so I'm going to walk through these terms of reference in this presentation. So the first one is data used. This is just a summary of the data used for the stock assessment. I'm going to start with life history data. Life history data included maturity based on historical data that were, for lack of a better word, I guess, discovered in the historical fishery-dependent database. These data were compared to current data that came from NEMAP. Those data were very similar. In the past, a paper had been used as a reference for maturity. It was recognized that that paper had been misinterpreted in the past, and so we had a new maturity ogive here. For natural mortality, we moved towards age-varying time constant values. And those values were scaled to estimates from the tagging data. So we moved away from the multi-species VPA, which you guys have typically seen, which had age and time varying natural mortality from 1982 to the present, and moved toward a time constant matrix. And I'll talk about this more in this major changes section. Growth was estimated similar to past assessments from fishery-dependent data. Okay, this figure is basically a figure of all the data pieces included over time. And so on the top it says year, whoops, you guys aren't there yet. Can we, thank you. From 55 to 2013, that's on the top. And then on the side are the data types, so removals or landings, composition, both age and length composition, and then indices. The slide's color-coded, so yellow is the reduction fishery, orange is the bait fishery, the green is the recruitment or young of the year index, and then the two different blue colors are the northern adult index and the southern adult index. And that's at the top if you want to reference that. So for removals, we have removal time series from 1955 to the present for both the reduction fishery and the bait fishery, as indicated at the top in yellow and orange. We have age composition data for the reduction fishery from 1955 to the present, indicated in yellow by the age composition label, and then underneath that there's a shorter bar that's orange. That's the bait fishery age compositions. Those start in 1985 and run to the present. For indices, there's the green bar that represents the young the year recruitment index, which starts in 1959. And then the other two indices are the Northern Adult Index, which is a composite of 7 trawl surveys, fishery independent surveys. That's the darker blue. That runs from 1980 to the present. And then the lighter blue underneath that runs from 1990 to the present, and that's the Southern Adult Index, which is a composite of 2 trawl surveys in the southern region. And then on the bottom there are the length comps associated with that. So I do have a note down here. Selectivity blocks are denoted here for the reduction fishery removals. At the top, you'll see it, SEL, Block 1, Block 2, Block 3. Those decisions were based on fishery changes over time. So for example, in 2005 in the southern region, there's a selectivity Block 3 that starts in 2005. That block was included because that's the year in which the Beaufort reduction plant closed down, and therefore the fall fishery wasn't operating after that. So the selectivity blocks that were chosen are based on fishery changes and also migratory patterns of the species. Moving to the next slide. The landings data, these are the overall landings data for the entire coast. The axis on, you're looking at it, your left is the reduction landings in thousands of metric tons. That's the solid black line. You can see those landings were quite high in the late 50s, declined, were lower in the 60s, increased somewhat in the 70s and 80s, and then have been declining since. On the other axis are the bait landings. Notice the scales are much different. That's the dashed line. Bait landings were relatively stable and then started increasing in the 80s, were stable again, and then increasing in the latter part of the time series. And then in 2013, the TAC was implemented, and so that is represented in here as well in the terminal year. Okay, next slide. For the fishery independent indices that were created, approximately 40 fishery independent data sets were brought to the table for consideration for this assessment from up and down the coast, from Rhode Island all the way through Florida. These data sets are not designed to sample Menhaden, but they are useful for Menhaden and potentially useful for other assessments. In order to be considered beyond sort of our first cut, they needed to meet certain criteria. For example, one of those criteria was the data set needed to be at least 10 years long. That's just one example. There was a series of criteria for them to make the cut and then move to the next step. If they made it to the next step, data sets were used to create standardized indices, and this was done to account for catchability differences due to things like time of the year, environment, stuff like that. And in the end, we ended up with 3 composite coast-wide indices of relative abundance. The first was a Young of the Year recruitment index that was composed of 16 data sets coast-wide, ranging from Georgia to Rhode Island. The second was the Northern Adult Index, which was composed of 7 fishery independent trawl surveys ranging from the Bay Area north to Connecticut. And then the Southern Adult Index, which was a composite of 2 surveys, specifically Georgia and CMAP. So those are the data that were used. The second term of reference was to consider precision and accuracy of those data. I just have a quick slide on this. But basically, we did assess that, uncertainty around those data was included. For example, there was uncertainty around annual landings values to account for things like measuring, reporting, and there was also uncertainty around the index values. As far as accuracy goes, comparisons among indices did support accuracy of the data. For example, the Northern Adult Index and the Southern Adult Index were correlated and showed the same general patterns over time and abundance. The stock assessment itself. Data were split into northern and southern regions. This is a big change from the last stock assessment, and I'll talk about it again in that major changes section. The data were split due to migratory patterns of the species. Fish are moving farther north the larger and older they are, coming back off the North Carolina coast and aggregating to spawn in the wintertime, and then moving again the next year according to age and size, with those larger or older individuals again moving farther north up the coast. In addition to that, there's fishery dynamics occurring with plants opening and closing throughout the duration of the time period from 55 to 2013. Currently, there's one reduction plant, but there's been as many as 20, ranging from Florida up to Maine. And in this process, we have analyzed some tagging data. They're the historical tagging data that were re-entered or re-keyed, and they've been analyzed, and they also support these same splits. This, you might hear me call this a fleets as areas model. So if you hear that, that's what I'm talking about. It's the spatial split in the data due to these migratory dynamics and fishery dynamics. This better accounts for the population dynamics of the species, and it better accounts for fishery removals over time. In this presentation, I'm using the run recommended by the CDAR review panel. So this run is the same as the base run in the report that came out, except that the length composition information is down-weighted. This allows the length information to inform selectivity of the indices, but not influence the other model outputs as much. So this is a figure of recruitment. Let's see if there we go. This is recruitment in billions of fish over time as estimated by the model. The 1958 year class sticks out, as it always does. We can track that class through the composition data, and we can see it pass through the fishery. After that 58-year class, there's a decline in recruitment in the 1960s, an increase with large recruitments occurring in the 70s and early 80s, declines then again into the 90s, and then at the end of the time series we have some upticks, and so there are some above average year classes for 2010 and also 2005 there. Biomass over time. This is biomass in thousands of metric tons. This has been variable over time. Again, this is very high in the late 50s, corresponding to that time when we saw the big year class in 58. And there's also been information about bigger year classes even before 58. Decline into the 60s, as we saw in the last slide, recruitment declined, and also the biomass is declining during this time period. An increase in biomass over the 70s and 80s. This is when we see those big recruitment classes. A major decline here in the 1990s with that recruitment decline, but also some fishing pressure going on there, and we'll see that when we get to the reference points slides. And then as we move into the 2000s, there's an increase in biomass over time. There were an increase in recruitment, especially with the large year classes of 2005 and 2010, but also reductions in fishing mortality rate over time. And then, okay. This is abundance. This is numbers and billions of fish at age. So the bottom color is red. That's age 0. As you'd expect, that's the bulk of the fish out there are age 0s. As you move up the bar, it becomes older and older age classes. These follow the same trends. You can see that 1958 year class there, quite large, and you can track that through as 1s, 2s, and beyond. An increase in the 70s and 80s in the numbers at age, and then an increase again in the 2000s. Okay, the next term of reference is characterizing uncertainty. I think I have one slide here. I have two. The first slide talks about sensitivity runs. So sensitivity runs, there are several of them in the stock assessment document. Please note they're not considered equally plausible alternate states of nature. They're used to assess the impact of assumptions made in the model. And a couple examples that I just pulled out here to include to discuss are: 1, fishery selectivities. There's an example sensitivity run in there where we looked at, okay, if the selectivity of the fleet was flat-topped or asymptotic, did that result in a different stock status? And it did not. We also looked at inclusion of indices, which indices were having a big impact or not. And so those are all in there. What I want the take-home message to basically be with the sensitivity runs is that the stock status was robust to model assumptions, and the stock status was the same as the base run in all cases with these sensitivity runs. In order to assess uncertainty, we also did what we've called Monte Carlo bootstrapping, so MCB. This accounts for uncertainty in the data itself. So every piece of data has an uncertainty associated with that, and so we're accounting for that in this analysis. But we're also accounting for uncertainty in model assumptions that have been made, such as natural mortality. So as you recall, we've gone to a age-varying, time-constant natural mortality, but we are assessing the uncertainty within that particular life history parameter through this run, through these runs. The take-home message for this as well is that the stock status was the same as the base run. Retrospective analyses, these were run back to 2009. There's no general statement about the fishing mortality rate. Pattern was dependent upon the age. F at age 2, no general pattern to discern there. F at age 3, if we looked at that, then we would say that we're under-predicting F by about 12% when compared to the base run with a terminal year of 2013. As far as recruitment goes, we're under-predicting recruitment by about 30% as compared to the base run with a terminal year of 2013. And then for fecundity, over-predicting fecundity by about 12% when compared to the terminal year of 2013. Okay, major changes from the last assessment. So the last benchmark assessment was in 2010. The update was in 2012. And several changes have occurred to this assessment. The first is that the maturity data are different in that basically the interpretation of the paper that was used for denoting maturity at the last for the last assessments. Basically, there was a misinterpretation. Those fish in that paper were labeled as active versus inactive, and inactive could be a spent fish could be considered inactive, and so we weren't getting an actual accurate picture of what the maturity should look like. And what happened was we We're looking at data that came from NEMAP, and then we found some data in the Historical Fishery Dependent Database, and we use those. They're very similar. And the ultimate result is that maturation is occurring at a younger age than what we had in previous assessments. And then in this version of the assessment, we're also accounting for changes in maturity over time. So maturity is linked to length, or is linked to length, and length is changing over time because we have this changing growth over time in this assessment. Another big change was the way natural mortality is handled. Natural mortality is time constant but age varying. What does that mean? The natural mortality still includes mortality due to all causes: disease, predation, environment, senescence. It still includes that. It's just not time varying. In addition, the estimates are similar to the estimates that were coming out of the MSVPA. And we did do a sensitivity run to look at if the stock status would change in any way if we use the time-varying natural mortality coming from the MSVPA, and it did not. Next set of changes, these are both index-related changes. In the last assessment, we had one fishery-dependent index based on the Potomac River Fishery Commission data set. In this assessment, we had two new fishery-independent indices of relative abundance. We use those indices to give information on relative changes in abundance over time on a broader spatial scale. So these indices had data from Georgia up to Connecticut included in them, and more fully use the state survey data available to us. The Young of the Year or Recruitment Index, you may have seen it called JAI, Juvenile Abundance Index, in the past. That was updated as well. It still starts in 1959 and runs the entire time series to the present. However, this time it includes more gears, more states, and has a broader spatial coverage. In this version of the assessment, too, the model was separated into northern and southern fleets. I've alluded to this in the past. There's concerns that the fish are migrating outside of the range of the fishery in present day because most of the fishing's off of Virginia, not all, but the bulk. And those fish are moving beyond typical fishing grounds. And so sort of looked at this and made the decision to separate into northern and southern fleets. That division was at the Virginia Eastern Shore, on the Virginia Eastern Shore there, so the bay is included in the southern region. This decision was supported by data, so we looked at changes in length and age over time by plant. So we're looking at latitude and where do we see differences occurring, and that's how we chose the break that we used for depicting northern and southern fleets. For fishery selectivity, this is an additional major change. Fishery selectivity was dome-shaped for this assessment, and this was supported by data. So the fishery independent surveys that were brought to the table for this assessment, recall I said approximately 40 of them, most of them had length data associated with them. Those lengths, when we looked into them further, some of those surveys were capturing fish larger than we'd ever seen in the fishery-dependent database, indicating that the fishery is not getting the full range of sizes of fish as you would expect. So there are data to support this decision, and therefore, the selectivities were allowed to be dome-shaped in this assessment, and they were also time-varying based on the changes in plant operation over time, as I said on that data slide with the colors. Those breaks were based on when were plants operating, where were they operating, were there some major changes in the fishery, and you can ask questions about that if you'd like. I'm good, thanks. Okay, reference points. We're currently using the board-selected reference points. Those reference points include a threshold, which is set at 15% MSP, or maximum spawning potential, a target, which is set at 30% MSP. These were chosen based on the 2010 assessment when the stock status in the terminal year was denoted to be at F8% of MSP. These were intended as interim reference points, and the board expressed that they would like to move toward ecosystem-based reference points, which Jay will be talking about next. So with those current reference points, here's your fishing mortality rate figure. So this is full F over time from 1955 to 2013. The blue line is F at 15%, and it is equal to 2.98. The F 30%, which is the target, is 1.03. And the F in the terminal year of the assessment, which is F 2013, is equal to 0.27. In the past, we're above the threshold in the late 50s, so the earliest years of this assessment, then rapidly declined, hovered around the target fishing mortality rate for most of the years, noting in the 90s there was a higher fishing mortality rate, and then since then declined. Along with that, we've got the fecundity-based component of it. This shows the blue line, which is the threshold for fecundity at fecundity 15%, which is just under 50,000. And this is billions of eggs. The orange line is the target, and that's fecundity at 30%. MSP, that's around 100,000. For most of the time period, we're bouncing kind of wildly around that target value. And then in 2013, the fecundity value is well above that target. So the stock status is not overfished, and overfishing not occurring based on the interim reference points established by the board. The interim reference points were based on the historical performance of the fishery, and there's some concern that through the TC that the current reference points may not actually be sustainable, given that we're no longer at F8% MSP, as was indicated in the last assessment. And so the TC would like to recommend reference points based on the same method that was used last time, this historical performance process of selection. And specifically, the recommendations are this. First recommendation is, instead of using full F, to use F at age 2. Specifically, this recommendation is centered around capturing the bulk of the fishery. So this represents fishing mortality rate for the largest segment of the fishery, specifically the southern reduction fleet, but also represents the fully selected age, given that we have dome-shaped selectivity occurring. In addition, as far as the MSP percentages, suggesting adopting percentages based on past fishery performance for the years 1960 to 2012. 1960 was chosen, some uncertainty in those early years, and likely those years were not sustainable. There was huge landings coming out of the fishery, and then we cut it off in 2012 because 2013 is the year in which the TAC was implemented. And the suggestion is for the threshold to use the maximum fishing mortality rate, and whatever that percentage is, use that as the threshold, and that happens to be F of 20% MSP. And then for the target, the suggestion is to use the median fishing mortality rate, and whatever that equates to in MSP, and it happens to be 39% MSP. And so I have those two figures here. The first is fishing mortality rate at age 2. The blue line is the fishing mortality rate threshold that's being suggested. That equates to F 20%. You'll see that that's the maximum fishing mortality rate from 1960 to 2012. Hence, 1 year hits that. And then the orange line is the recommended target, and that is an F of 39% MSP, and it equates to 0.71. That's the median fishing mortality rate for the time period of 1960 to 2012. The current fishing mortality rate in 2013 is 0.24, which is below both the threshold and target. Moving on to the fecundity side of that, if we use the fecundity 20% MSP, then that threshold is just over 67,000 billions of eggs. This is trillions of eggs. The orange then is the fecundity 39%, which is just over 130,000 on this figure. And then the fecundity in the terminal year 2013 is above both the target and the threshold here. So stock status using the TC recommendation is not overfished, and overfishing is not occurring. Projections were done, but they haven't been updated based on the recommended base run from the review workshop. Projections will likely show that maintaining current harvest will not jeopardize the stock status moving forward, and the technical committee is prepared to run additional projections as directed by the board. So the research recommendations that are coming out of this assessment: first, we'll do some short-term recommendations for some data collection. First, continue current sampling levels from the bait fisheries. This will help inform the bait fishery catch at age in the future, and the sampling definitely could be improved over time. Analyze the sampling adequacy of the reduction fishery, and then sample areas outside of the reduction fishery. So specifically collect age structure and biological data outside the range of the fishery. We have a lot of fishery-dependent data, and we need to focus on some fishery-independent data collection. Conduct an aging validation study, particularly looking at scale otolith comparisons. And one other additional idea was to maybe look at some radioisotopes with archived scales. We actually have all the scales archived at the Beaufort lab still. The next one is conduct an aging workshop to assess the precision and error among readers for aging. This is planned for March 2015. There's actually a date selected for this. And then conduct a comprehensive fecundity study. These are all the short-term data collection needs. Long-term, develop a Menhaden-specific coast-wide fishery-independent index of adult abundance at age. This one comes up every time. It's bolded, it's high priority, it's a critical need. Conduct studies on spatial and temporal dynamics of spawning. How often do they spawn? How many times a year do they spawn? Are they batch spawners? More information about their spawning activities would help. Conduct studies on productivity of estuarine environments related to recruitment dynamics. So which estuarine environments are producing the most recruitment? Where are we getting our recruitments from? Is it one place or is it across the board? Assessment methodology recommendations. Conduct a management strategy evaluation. A management strategy evaluation would help with making decisions on which reference points to choose. Conduct a multi-objective decision analysis. You guys, I think, have seen this come up. We've called it MODA. Basically, having managers put in objectives that they would be interested in seeing, both on the Menhaden side, but also on any of the other multi-species sides. So, for instance, you might have objectives for striped bass, weak fish, bluefish, etc. Continue to develop an integrated length and age-based model. Continue to improve methods for incorporation of natural mortality. And this gets back to MSVPA, whether we should proceed with that or move to something else. And then develop a seasonal, spatially explicit model once sufficient age-specific data on movement rates of Menhaden are available, and that's specifically related to continued use of the tagging data that were rekeyed. So recommended timing of the next assessment. All of these research recommendations were made as either short or long-term recommendations, with the idea that short-term recommendations could be completed before the next benchmark assessment, which would occur in 6 years, and assuming that there would be an update in 3 years. Long-term recommendations were those that likely could not be completed before the next benchmark assessment, so the long-term recommendations were things that we were seeing that would probably take 6 or more years to complete. Future directions, the technical committee needs to review the formal review workshop report yet, and that will be done in the future. In addition to that, some work that will likely occur before the next assessment, the first of which is a management strategy evaluation, or that MSE, as I've said, can help guide with reference point selection in the future. And then also analysis of the tagging data. Those data can help provide information on the spatial stock assessment model and how we would move forward with that. That's what I have. Took term of reference by term of reference, and I'll open up for questions.
Amy, thank you for that excellent comprehensive report. I imagine there's some questions around the table, so we'll look for questions for Amy. Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very complete report. Thank you. A couple of questions. Going back to your charts on recommendations for thresholds and target under fishing mortality, that particular chart where the technical committee proposed that the target and threshold should be at a certain number. Where does that compare with where it is now? Are you raising that bar, or both bars actually, from where they are now?
Okay. The fishing mortality rate, so the recommendation is more conservative. So the current interim reference point for fishing mortality rate, the threshold is 2.98. The TC recommendation is 1.80. So it's a decrease in the fishing mortality rate with the new recommendation for the threshold and the target.
Even though your report indicated that the stock status is sustainable and it seems to be going along okay, let's put it that way, you're still requesting to lower the bar?
Yes. The reason why is that when you look at the reference points, the interim reference points compared to the figures that we have, there's never been a time, except for in the 50s, when we've gone above that. And so there was concern amongst the panel that that might not actually be a sustainable level. And so we're trying to use this historical, I called it historical performance. Basically, the fisheries seems to have been sustainable. It's still around. It's still harvesting fish. Therefore, we're using this time period where we think it's sustainable, and we're using that to recommend some new reference points.
Follow-up, Mr. Chairman. On another chart, I'm assuming that the maturity rate being higher than you thought is a good thing. I would think that they mature sooner than you thought. Okay, that's good. Are you doing the same with that chart where you're upping those bars on that particular chart, which I think came right after the chart I just talked about? Are you changing that too?
Yeah. So I think you're referring to the fecundity-based reference points. Those reference points would change corresponding to the recommendations for the fishing mortality rate. So the fishing mortality rate recommendation is made, and then there is a corresponding fecundity reference point with that goes with that percentage.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to see that something's not overfished for a change, and overfishing isn't occurring. How do we deal with success? Thank you.
Kyle.
Thank you for your report. It's good to see the data coming in and being able to have a good TC report that's that everybody feels comfortable with in the TC. My question is using the new targets and whatnot. Has fishing not occurred and overfishing's not hadn't happened since 2000? That's what the graphs kind of showed. So we could basically say that we've been doing a proper fishing level, for the last 20 years. Is that your conclusion?
Yeah, we've been below with the current reference points, the formally adopted one, we've been below the target since the very late 90s, maybe 1999, 2000. We've been below the threshold most of the time period since the 50s. If we use the recommended technical committee reference points, the same thing holds there. We've been below the target since about 2000.
Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Schuller. I just want to thank you. You guys did a great job. I know it was a lot of work, and it's just a really nice assessment and a nice piece of work. I had a question about natural mortality, and if you want to kick me over to Jay, that's fine. So now we have a natural mortality rate that's time invariant but age specific. So my question is, when you had explained all the things that natural mortality contains, so it contains senescence and predation and all those things, my question to you is, on the predation piece of it, as we're thinking about this assessment in a single species context, what is the predator state that's accounted for in that M? So is it an average level of predators over the time series of the assessment, or is it, can you clarify a little bit when you say predation's in there, what's that state? Thank you.
Yeah, that's not an easy question. I guess to me, when I think about it, I would think it's the middle of the road, right? I mean, we're certainly not accounting for if a certain species that has menhaden as a big forage component is very high or very low. But if we get in the middle of the road there, then we're still capturing those dynamics, that part of the entire fishery dynamics somewhat. And this board has indicated that they'd like to move towards ecosystem-based reference points, and obviously a component of this stock assessment, term of reference number 7, was that addressing that and putting forward some methods in which to address those wants from the board, which Jay will be talking about next. So,
Doug?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Schuller, for an excellent report. I was wondering if Melissa could potentially put up a couple slides that sort of struck me, and they are the slides that have the total abundance, and then the following, and the one before it that says biomass. And the thing that struck me was that the biomass seemed to be at a very high level, even compared to levels back in the 50s. Yet what I saw in the trend in the abundance graph, which was the follow-up one, there seemed to be a decline happening in the past, most recent 5 to 6 years. So one, I'd like to find out why there's that kind of discrepancy, and two, did the assessment committee and peer review have any concern with that declining trend in abundance that we were seeing there?
Yeah, I'll have you put it up on that abundance slide. So, can you switch back to the colored? Okay. So both of these figures show similar trends, right? So we sort of have this very high abundance in biomass in the late 50s, sharp decline, 60s, up again in the 70s and 80s, down in the 90s, and then an uptick again in the 2000s. The biomass plot and the abundance plot do look different in that the biomass seems to have come up on par with some of the other historical biomass levels, where abundance looks like it is not quite as high. My thoughts on this are that there are currently more bigger, older fish out there. Therefore, there may be fewer fish, therefore fewer total abundance. You're really talking about age 0s and age 1s if you look at this figure. And those older, bigger fish are going to play into your biomass more because they weigh more. And so I think that's the trade-off that we're seeing in those two figures, is that the composition of what's out in the population and what size fish they are.
Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Amy, and your colleagues. And you set a high standard in a short amount of time, I think, to go through this process, so thank you. My question is really straightforward. You mentioned when the recruitment slide was up that 2005 and 2010 were above average. There's certainly some fluctuations there. I was wondering if there was any sort of discussion by the technical committee, or we'll hear something from the peer review about the level of recruitment. I know it's something that is always pointed to, and throughout the 2009 assessment after that, I think we kept hearing that fishing mortality rate and recruitment are decoupled. There's no significant relationship there, no coefficient of determination, I assume. So how do you really look at the current recruitment? Are you looking at that in the whole time series from the 50s on? Should the average be a moving average? What's involved there?
When I said average, I meant basically over the time series. So, I mean, if you look at this figure, there's anything above 20 here, right, is a decent year class on this figure. And you're talking about that 58 year class, the 70s, 80s, and then those two in the late 2000s. Not to say that the recruitment in the 2000s, it's still higher than what we're seeing in the 1990s. Those year classes, 2005 and 2010, also play out in the fishery-dependent data, so we can track them through the composition data. Do you want to, does that answer your question?
We'll follow up. I think it does mostly. I guess my real question is, what type of concern should there be for after 2010, or is that an expectation given the variability, the inherent variability?
I mean, you're right. The 2011, 12, 13 recruitment classes there are lower, on par with what's in the 60s and the 90s. Let me look at this again. Sorry, I was just looking at how the retrospective was treating recruitment, just to see if that's part of the picture. It could be a concern. It could be those cohorts are, we'd call them sort of incomplete in the model. So their ages 0 in 2013. So the only data point we have for that is that 2013 recruitment index, where if we move back in time, we can actually use other data pieces to fill out that picture, because we're seeing them grow older and move up into that population and fishery. So potentially there could be some concern they are lower.
Follow up.
Mic is on. Okay. One other question, and I may not have seen it, Amy, but in the retrospective, how's the recruitment treated, since it's also a model-based aspect?
I'm not sure I understand what your question is. You are asking how the recruitment is treated in the retrospective component?
Yes, is there bias in either direction?
Okay. If I'm understanding your question correctly, the model is under-predicting recruitment by about 30%. And we haven't done any corrections or anything like that on it, if that's what you're asking.
I think that's fine, Mr. Chairman, and that answers. There was you had that in a Word slide, I guess, as part of one of your slides, but I wondered if you'd had anything actually shown. The 30% is a good answer. Thank you.
Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Schuler, for an excellent job to you and through you to your colleagues on this assessment. When the board was working through the allocation issue, we struggled with uncertainty with regard to landings, particularly in the bait fishery. I'm wondering how the assessment, you spoke to it, you noted there was uncertainty and it was addressed. I'm curious as to whether you found decreasing uncertainty in more recent data sets with regard to the bait fishery versus past years, prior years, and again, how the assessment sort of incorporated what I would assume would be a increasing trend toward better landings data, particularly from the bait fishery. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Throughout this assessment, all of these data pieces are improving in quality over time, meaning we're getting a better handle on actually what is being removed from the fishery, the indices, all the data component pieces. The sample sizes on things have increased, so you are right. Over time, we have more information on exactly what's being removed from bait. We handle this in the model with a break, so the earliest data had more uncertainty with it, more recent data had less uncertainty with it. We didn't necessarily specify, 2000 had more uncertainty than 2005, though.
Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Schuler, for your presentation. Mr. Chairman, I have two separate questions. Is it okay if I ask them both, or do you want to come back to me later? Thank you. Thank you. My first question is, so what is the relationship, if any, between recruitment and FEC?
Yeah, well, typically it would be the stock recruitment relationship. In this instance, the model's estimating a median recruitment and then yearly deviations using information from the recruitment index. And so we're not assuming any relationship between recruitment and fecundity.
So high fecundity does not necessarily result in high recruitment, nor does low fecundity result in low recruitment, if I'm understanding you.
Correct.
Thank you. And my other question is, for those very large fish that you found in the fishery independent surveys, are they mostly or all in the northern fleet?
They are in the northern fleet, in the northern data sets mostly. They're in the northern fishery independent gears. There's several of them, but yes, in the north.
So larger and older fish are generally tending to go further north, and there's still that.
Yeah, it's another piece of evidence to support that.
Thank you.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to Doug's question, to the abundance and the age makeup structure of the population, would you characterize the existing population with the age structure that it has as a healthy population that's something that we should be striving towards, or does this age makeup give you concern?
I suppose it depends on what you consider a healthy population. And that's I'm struggling with this question because I have my thoughts on it based on the assessment, but then there's also things that could be discussed around this table by the board as to what they think or classify as a healthy population. So it's not a straightforward.
I guess what typically would be seen as a healthy population in across fisheries?
I mean, you would hope for a filled out age structure, and there doesn't seem to be any reason for concern here related to that.
Bill Goldsboro.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Schuler, for your presentation. I, too, had a question about recruitment and those two recent peaks, the 05 and 2010 peaks. And I wonder, to understand them a little better, if you could say something about the way the coast-wide recruitment index is put together, because I know that those peaks don't appear in Maryland's juvenile index. I don't know about Virginia's, but I'm wondering, I seem to recall a few years ago reports of an abundance of juveniles in more northern waters, and so I'm wondering if we can drill down a little bit, if there's any indication of what might be driving those peaks, and beyond that, if we see any indication that the epicenter of recruitment, if you will, might be shifting a little to the north.
So you're correct in saying that the Maryland-specific striped bass seine survey data didn't necessarily show those peaks. You're right, it is coming from the northern regions, and those fish are tracking through the composition data, et cetera. So those are signals that are seen in multiple data sources in the model. Is the epicenter of recruitment moving north? I don't know that we've explored the data we have enough to sit at the table and give a good answer on that. At least I don't feel like I have. And that's something that could be looked at in the future. And it was something that was a research recommendation in this.
Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Amy. This is a tremendous amount of work, and we're very encouraged by the amount of data that went into it. And I know that the industry, not only the reduction industry, but the bait industry, has been working to provide samples for aging over the recent years, and it turned out, I think, that really helped make some of the decisions particularly about doming. And I can recall that there were actually some midwater trawl catches of large menhaden. I think that was the first time I'd ever heard anybody say something positive about midwater trawl bycatch, actually, but it was kind of a nice outcome because it demonstrated that those older fish, do seem to be out there. And I think you mentioned that, having a stock that's exhibiting a good mix of age classes does represent, a healthy stock. And I think there's nothing but good news here from our perspective in the fishery. I have a couple of temporal questions. There was a long list of things to be done, but no estimate of the amount of time that it might take to do all those things. And, specifically, I noted that the technical committee still needs to review the formal workshop report. That kind of surprises me, since the technical committee has been sitting around putting this assessment together for months. So I have a question about how long you would anticipate that to take. There's also one of the bullets was that the management strategy evaluation process should be used to guide reference point selection. And at the same time, however, the technical committee is making some very specific recommendations about a reference point. So, and then thirdly, my question is, how long would it take the technical committee to develop projections of yield from this stock that would be based on the F20% MSP threshold and the F30% MSP target? Thank you.
Okay, Jeff. First, the technical committee, they've reviewed the stock assessment report. That was done in November before it went to the review workshop. The review workshop was completed in the second week of December, the 9th through the 11th. The report with the review workshop report came out in mid-January, I think the 16th. And I haven't seen the CIE reviews yet. And so the full set of review documents isn't even in yet. And that's what the technical committee hasn't reviewed, is those review documents yet. We haven't sat down as a group and gone through those review documents. The next question was, the research recommendation. Yeah, I thought it was the reference points.
Well, in terms of that issue, what is the time estimate for sitting down and reviewing that, getting the CIE review? You're talking weeks, months? I think it's critical to trying to get more yield out of this assessment, which the bait fishery for sure is very interested in. So, my question was about how long would that take specifically?
Jeff, I'll jump in for Amy and just say that the plan from staff's perspective would, for the board, be to direct the technical committee to review the peer review report during March TC meeting week and come back in May after having done that, potentially with any projections that the board would like to see. They have projection methodology that was a part of this assessment and was part of the peer review. So I think there's, the timing, we wanted to make sure that the board was delivered the results of this assessment as soon as we could, and that didn't provide us the opportunity to go through all of that. Like, another example would be the advisory panel, I'm sure, would like to see the peer review report as well. So I anticipate those tasks to come from the board for between now and our May meeting.
All right, that's encouraging, and that means that if the board did request you to run the projections on the new reference points that you're recommending, that information could come back as early as May. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Lewis.
How is fecundity used in the assessment?
Fecundity is an estimated quantity, so it's based on number of fish, and then the fecundity is an estimate. I guess your question is, how is it used in the model? It's something that's calculated as an output. It's not used to estimate anything. It's basically an output. And the fecundity relationship comes from a paper that's cited in the assessment report.
Just the thing that kind of jumped out to me, and I think everybody knows how I feel about ecosystem modeling, but just looking at the data needs and the research recommendations, there's still a lot about this single species management that we don't know a lot about. The thing that really jumped out at me was not even knowing if they're batch spawners or not, and that's not a criticism of the panel. Y'all did an excellent job with this, but I mean, if we don't even know that they're batch spawners or not, I don't know how we determine fecundity. So I guess it's kind of a swag. It does surprise me with being a stock that we probably know as much or more about than any other stock that we manage, that basic information like that is unavailable to us. And so I just would ask that we keep that in mind as we move forward with the discussion on a potential amendment. Would also ask, though, whether or not for the technical committee, whether these reference points are reasonable. There are some concerning trends to me in the population biomass, and particularly the recruitment indexes, which would tend to indicate that maybe the 15-30% estimate MSP is probably too low to provide the ecosystem function that we're trying to get out of Menhaden. So I would like to have some discussion about that. Maybe it would be more appropriate during the ecosystem discussion. Maybe it'll be more important in our deliberations later. But wanted to bring that point up on fecundity, and I just wasn't real sure how that was used. And it did strike me as interesting that batch spawning was a thing. And then the other thing that was extremely questioning to me was the senescence part of the natural mortality rate. And we can talk about that offline, but that's an interesting component that I'd like to know more about. Thank you.
Thanks, Lewis. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jeff Kalin asked a question very similar to mine, and I think I got the answer.
Lynn?
Thank you. I think this follows up on Lewis's point. I'm also struck by fecundity, and as we're trying to get straight reference points and think about what we're going to do with the reference points, when you look at the graphs of abundance and fecundity, they seem to be opposite of each other somewhat. So they're both cyclical. Abundance recently is lower, but fecundity recently is very high. And as I understand, that's because of this very interesting trait of Menhaden, that when there's fewer of them, they become more fecund. Or there's a density-dependent impact on fecundity, so when there's fewer, they grow faster and they're more fecund. Is that true?
I think you're seeing what was already pointed out in this biomass figure, and it's that with more older fish, those fish have a higher fecundity, therefore that fecundity is going to be up.
Right, so my question is, it almost seems like when you look at the graphs together that you would tend to possibly have higher fecundity when your abundances are lower. And if is that true? And if it's not, then I'll just stop talking.
I don't know that would be true. I mean, it would depend on why, is the abundance lower because there's less recruits, or is the abundance lower because there's less older fish? And there's multiple components to consider there.
Okay.
So I don't think it's as straightforward as that.
Okay. And I guess what I was getting at is there's some break point where this density-dependent effect on fecundity starts to become negative rather than positive on fecundity. But if it's not really that density-dependent effect, then it's sort of a moot question. So, thank you.
Any other questions from the board for Amy? Rob.
want to come back to the same question I had before, and it's about recruitment. And I guess what I was thinking about, Amy, was there's a couple of figures in our reports that show the removals, both north of Virginia Eastern Shore and from Virginia Eastern Shore and south by the reduction fishery. And certainly in both cases, they're somewhat at a low phase. And given that, how should we look at recent recruitment? How should we really be looking at that in relation to removals? Not just the snapshot from the last few years, but I think that's just an overall question through the time series.
So I think your question is that, is recruitment being driven by fishing mortality rate? Is that what your question is?
Not exactly. My question is, when there's a lot of concern I've heard over the years about recruitment, and it's expressed after each time there's an assessment. Current recruitment, let's just say for the last 3 years, as you mentioned, is on the low side compared to 2010. However, when I look at the removals, I see that removals are also lower. And I guess this is the reduction fishery, and I guess at the same time, if we had a plot of what the natural mortality was as well on top of that, we would put all that together, and we might be able to say something objectively about recruitment, whether or not there is a concern or not concern, which might go beyond there's a 30% bias that occurs, that it's underestimated. And I'm just wondering, is that part of the conversation of the technical committee, putting these pieces together?
The natural mortality rate is constant in this assessment. So kind of take that out of your frame of reference. That would get more at the ecosystem part of it. With the fishing mortality rate decreasing, that's a good thing, right, for sustainability. It just depends on what the management goals and objectives are and sort of where the board would decide that they think the population should be. The recruitment, I don't know that we agonized over the last 3 years being lower, given all the other things that we agonized over. That is something you could pitch back to the technical committee and ask them if they have thoughts on.
Thank you, Amy. Any other questions from the board for Amy? Dr. Schuler, again, thank you for a very thorough and comprehensive report, as well as the work of your team. We really appreciate your wisdom here. We'll move on now to Jay McNamee, presentation on ecological reference points. Jay, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jay McNamee. I work for the Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife. And so I've got a presentation here that's going to walk through some of the ecological reference point work that we've done, mostly through the Biological and Ecological Reference Point Group, the so-called BERP. We thought the name was pretty clever. So we've teased term of reference 7 already about a half dozen times, so I hope we can live up to the hype here. But just to restate it, term of reference 7, and I think there was another set of term of references for the peer review group, and I think it switched to number 8 in that one. But the one that I grabbed was this one, and it was to identify potential ecological reference points that account for Atlantic menhaden's role as a forage fish, to provide proposed methodology, a model development plan, and example results using a preliminary model configuration if time allows. Time didn't allow for all of that, but what we did do was we brought forward a suite of tools that we were looking at as a group, and we brought that into the peer review process to get some expert opinion on some of those tools that we were looking at. So just an overview of this presentation. I'll try to go relatively quick. It's text heavy, no colorful pictures. I apologize for that. But what we're trying to do here is introduce to you the toolbox that we're looking at, the different models, the different approaches that we're looking at. So the presentation is going to focus on those tools. There are 4 broad categories that capture the types of things that we're looking at. So you'll see the presentation kind of broken up into these 4 categories. And then after I finish with our comments on each of the categories, I'll also touch on what the peer review panel said about those approaches as well. Hopefully not stealing Dr. Jones's thunder, but hopefully the repetition will help and kind of lock some of this stuff in for you. So the very first approach we looked at was ecosystem indicators. And so as we step through these 4 categories, we're going to go from simplest to complex. So there's a progression there as well. And so we're starting off with some simple things. So the development of ecological reference points, so I'll say ERPs from now on to save time, is a complex and time-intensive process, but a number of methods exist that could provide more timely indicators of ecosystem health. These indicators, they're not quantitative per se. However, these qualitative reference points can provide information on the status of the whole ecosystem, the whole system as it stands right now. In addition, we can turn these sorts of things over pretty quick, so we can update these relatively quickly as opposed to some of the more complex procedures. These sorts of ecosystem indicators could be used as interim or even complementary steps in the development of ERPs. And some of the things that we looked at were environmental indicators like chlorophyll A indexes or sea surface temperature, or big climate-driven cycles like the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation or the North Atlantic oscillation. We also looked at indices of forage abundance, and we looked at prey to predator ratios, and these are the different types of ecosystem indicators we looked at. So here are some comments from the peer review panel on those approaches. The panel agreed that the monitoring of such indicators would likely be informative. It would be helpful for us to be able to track these things. The drawback, though, is there's not a strong connection between most of these indicators and then triggers for management action. And these are the usual motivation for reference points. You hit some threshold and there's some associated action that accompanies that. 2 exceptions are the forage species abundance and the predator to prey ratios, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. So tracking these indicators, it would likely have value, and we talked about them as ecosystem-based fishery management dashboard. So something you could get a quick look at and develop some thoughts in that sort of context. But they're less important for the development of ERPs for the Menhaden fishery specifically. So still some panel comments on the ecosystem indicators. The panel viewed the following indicators as more directly relevant to the development of ERPs, and that's the abundance of forage species, either a particular forage species or a group of forage species together, and predator-prey ratios. These 2 types have the potential to be directly related to key management objectives. It would require empirical or some sort of theoretical argument that particular levels of forage abundance or some particular ratio is associated with some consequence that's germane to the ERP target or threshold. So there's still some work that needs to be developed to kind of turn these into useful indicators, but they still do have some value. It would be desirable to explicitly couple these biological indicators with models that aim to capture relevant predator-prey or food web dynamics. So to bring these indicators together with some of the other things we'll talk about might be a good thing to do. Okay, the next approach that we looked at were nutrition reference points. So these are reference points describing desirable and undesirable nutrition or nutritional status of predatory fishes in general. We're talking about predatory fishes here. So that would be useful for judging available forage. The concept could be developed into a systematic ERP. You could use existing surveys for nutritional status. Some of these exist. I know one exists for the striped bass species in Chesapeake Bay, for instance. Or a coast-wide approach could be developed as well. So some of these reference point, nutritional reference points could be body fat indices, bioelectric impedance indices, or consumption indices. So namely, you'd look at the grams of prey you have per gram of predator that you have. So the peer review panel comments on these, the panel discussed these, they kind of talked about these in their comments amongst all of the other ecological indicators, which I just talked about. The panel noted that these might be useful for ERP development if empirical relationships between this nutritional status and demographic or economic effects could be established. So you'd have to make some sort of, you have to put another layer on there and make some linkages. Okay, we're going to start to get into some of the modeling approaches, starting with our simpler modeling approaches. We looked at some production models. So biomass dynamic models, type of production model with an additional predation function incorporated into it, have been useful in exploring the role of predation for certain marine species. So there are some examples of using these types of production models out there. The virtues of these multi-species production models are they're tractable, they're kind of easy to follow, they're also easy to parameterize. So like we said, they're simple modeling approaches that are easy to interpret and easy to parameterize, therefore could probably be turned around in short order relative to some of the more complex approaches. These modeling types can generate all sorts of estimates. They can develop estimates of undifferentiated prey biomass losses to key predators and estimates of prey biomass. You can develop predation mortality, fishing mortality, and some of these methods can also provide time-varying estimates of some of these parameters as well. One of the ones we looked at has a time-varying component in it. So these models can provide independent index-based assessments, or you can use them in combination where you take output from other multi-species models to provide another view of the dynamic. So you can use them kind of in parallel. The two types of production models that we looked at were the Steele-Henderson model and the surplus production model with time-varying R. These were two production model types that we looked at within the group. The peer review panel comments. The panel generally liked the suite of modeling approaches reviewed. They felt it was pretty comprehensive. They noted that it would be desirable to explore a range of modeling strategies from simple models like the surplus production models to more complex modeling structures. A primary goal should be to determine the extent to which the dynamics of menhaden and their predators are connected. So there should be a specific hypothesis analysis when you're looking into these types of models. And the model development should consider whether important effects are likely to be only from predators or whether menhaden abundance can also affect the abundance of its predators. So is there feedback in this as well? As prey populations decrease, does that have an impact on your predator population? Multi-species approaches, jointly modeling the dynamics of both menhaden and menhaden's predators will provide a more realistic representation of population dynamics and better opportunities to develop useful ERPs. Okay, the next progression up the chain of complexity here is single species models, single species statistical catch at age models. The nice thing about them is they can encompass the whole coastwide spatial extent of the population. Examples of some of the reference points that can be developed with single species models are reference points based on fishing mortality being some proportion of natural mortality, or biomass being kept at a level at some proportion of the unfished biomass. So there's different ways you can develop ERPs from a single species assessment. These sorts of ERPs have been advocated for and suggested by recent forage fish documents, but these are not directly developed on menhaden. They're based on expert opinion of related species, but not specifically on menhaden. And the data requirements are standard stock assessment data needs, catch at age, indices of abundance. So these are all things that we know how to get and know how to handle. The things that we looked at include BAM. You may have heard of that one before. We also looked at a time-varying natural mortality model. It had some interesting Bayesian components, Bayesian statistical components in it. Some of the peer review panel comments, they talked about all of the modeling approaches kind of together. And so there wasn't anything explicitly about the single species models per se, but one additional note that they did make was simpler approaches may provide interim solutions, and these are things that you can do in the short term while you're developing some of these more complex approaches. Okay, here's the last approach. These are the hyper-complex multi-species models. One method of interest to managers, this board has expressed interest in them in the past, as well, is to explicitly model a defined ecosystem. The nice thing about this approach is it allows for the connection of standard stock assessment models, so things we know how to handle, and we connect them through trophic calculations or energy budgets. These approaches allow for direct calculation of predation on target prey species by specific predators, and in some cases you can also develop that feedback mechanism. These approaches can be, or I'll say more boldly, are labor and data intensive and are highly complex. Some of the ones that we looked at in the BURP committee are the multi-species virtual population analysis. So this is the MSVPA that you all have seen in the past. There's also a multi-species statistical catch at age model in development. And we also talked about EcoPath with EcoSim as well. So some of the peer review panel comments. The panel was hesitant to encourage investment of a lot of effort into the development of models that include a ton of species, a ton of trophic levels. What they said instead was the ideal approach is to do a model of minimum sufficient complexity, which I thought was a really cool way to couch that. And even went on to suggest perhaps a 2 trophic level predator-prey model constructed within a statistical framework might be a good first step. The panel was not enthusiastic about utilizing a whole food web model such as EWE or Atlantis, and it's not that they don't like those models or anything like that. What they were getting at is don't invest all of your time and all of your energy into the most complex modeling type if it means you can't invest in some of the simpler approaches. So that's what they meant with that comment. I think it's a good comment. All right, a couple of summary slides here. It's been difficult to make a recommendation on which ERP would be best to adopt for Atlantic Menhaden, and this has been the main task of the BURP committee. We've talked about it for many years now. But the reason it's been such a struggle is there's two main questions that need to be addressed before significant progress can be made on this development. The first, the most important question is, what are the goals and objectives of the board? And so what we need is a statement of ecological or ecosystem goals and objectives for Menhaden management, and that should be provided by the board, the stakeholders, the constituents. The next thing we need to do is scientifically test the approaches that we're going to use. So we've already investigated them. We can manage most of the ones we talked about in this presentation. But the next thing to do is to dig in and really test these things, review them, use simulated data, all those sorts of things that we do. So the performance of the proposed ERPs and the models used, they can be evaluated through multi-model comparisons, through simulation testing, and completion of single and multi-species management strategy evaluation. So there's that comment again on management strategy evaluation for these, as well as the single species approach we talked about earlier. Although most of the options presented in the report are not ready for immediate management use, some of them could be used in a shorter time frame. So the BAM-based reference points that account for forward services could be adopted at any time using the most recent peer-reviewed Menhaden model. These ad hoc forward service reference points may be more conservative than single species reference points, so it's a note of caution. And another note of caution is density-dependent effects and unpredictable recruitment could negate any of the benefits that we're attempting to achieve by leaving more prey fish in the water. We need, just to restate, we need additional technical work and peer review of that work on these ERPs before they're ready for management use. And then I'll end here with our favorite comment from the peer review report, and it's just a good parting thought. So the Atlantic Menhaden Technical Committee has done a thorough job of investigating and summarizing the options. Now it's time for managers and stakeholders to guide the way forward. So I will pause there for dramatic effect. And then this is just something I'll leave up. I'm not going to go through the table. Something you can stare at while you're thinking about your questions. But we've talked about objectives and goals. So if you look across the top of this table, we thought we would go ahead and seed the discussion on what objectives or goals might look like. And this is just based on a brainstorming session we had at the end of a very long meeting. But it's things that we've heard stakeholders say, we've heard board members say, and we just tried to itemize some of those. And then down the left-hand column there, what you see are the different modeling types that I've just gone through in this presentation. So those should look familiar to you too. And then the objectives that we think each of those types of approaches could inform has a little X in that box. So I will stop talking and leave some time for questions.
Thank you, Jay. Questions for Jay? Bill.
Just a quick one, Mr. Chairman. Could we leave up Jay's first summary slide for a few minutes?
Question? Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, Jay, I was going to look at your second summary slide, because if you ever fail in fisheries, you probably could run for political office with that last statement. Just on the ERPs, after looking at them, I'm assuming you could use multiple ERPs in the and you could look at multiple ones, not have one specific one, which then I guess on one side that would be good, because if you have, since they're a little squirrely the way they connect back to the fishery, like that nutrition index, sounds like you kind of get a leap of faith getting back to it. But I mean, if you have multiple ones, that would give you a greater assurance, I would think. However, then if they start disagreeing, then then what do you have? So did the TC discuss that at all in terms of multiple ones and the pros and cons of doing that? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think it's a good comment. What I kind of walk through here are not ERPs per se, they're tools to get at ERPs. So we could absolutely look at a number of different ecological reference points, and they would change depending on the type of approach that you're looking at here. You'd have to use different ones with some of these different methodologies. So I think it would be imperative to at first have multiple ERPs that are reviewed and tested so that you know which ones perform the best.
Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment. I think, both this board and the New England Council and the Mid-Atlantic Council are all wrestling with, how do we move to ecosystem-based fisheries management or ecosystem approaches to fisheries management and so forth. And we just had this discussion in Portsmouth last week that it's important for the management entities, I think, to kind of be on the same page as we develop an approach here. And I wanted to speak specifically to the slide that Jason had up about the single species modeling options and the comment that simpler approaches, may provide good interim solutions. And one of the slides had some bullets with some suggested, harvest control rules around ecosystem values, F equals M or F 75% MSY and so forth. Of course, we don't have an MSY projection for this stock because of the life history stages and so forth. But my question is, can the technical committee provide a real simple kind of graphic presentation of M versus fishing mortality as projected in this assessment? In other words, what I think M is projected, this constant M is 0.40, I think, and F is 0.27 at the terminal year, 2013. What does that mean in terms of metric tons removed on an annual basis for comparison purposes? In other words, what's the ratio between the estimated M in the assessment and the mortality at the fishing effort rates that are being estimated in the terminal year? I mean, it ought to be a fairly simple thing to demonstrate that there's a tremendous amount of fish being left in the water, I think, relative to Atlantic Menhaden. And I think the last thing we want to do is allow a lot of fish to die and underfish the resource. So is there a way to graphically demonstrate M versus F in estimates that come out of this assessment so that the public can understand that relationship, that ratio, and perhaps be comfortable that a significant amount of fish is being left in the water every year? Thank you.
It's a little more complex. It won't be so. The reason it's more complex is because you have what we use is not a static M across all ages, but a vector of M that's different depending on the age. It was static through time. So it would have to be like a matrix kind of setup. We can also, though, develop F at age as well. So conceivably, we could do that, not right now, but for a future meeting, we could, I think, put that together.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Lewis.
I guess I'll take a little different approach here. Having been dealing with these issues for now quite a long time, and I mean, a lot of y'all were in Baltimore when we had our Menhaden meeting, and we had a pretty nice crowd. I know Mike and I remember it vividly. A lot of you do too. And thinking about the difficulties this commission has on a regular basis trying to convince folks to take necessary management actions based on a good stock assessment. Even then, it's hard. I would take a different approach to calling it underfishing Menhaden. I don't think you can underfish Menhaden. I think the more fish left in the water, the better. I think we need to be taking more of a Linfest approach in terms of the target biomasses that we're trying to accomplish. I think we've seen a great result. Nothing that we did, really, probably. It just happens to be a change in the modeling design that resulted in a lot of good information. But I just wonder if we take a more conservative approach on Menhaden and we look at the current F and biomass levels and we set a target a little bit higher or a lot higher depending on how this board wants to move forward. What's the difference between that and an ecosystem approach? If you're being more conservative and you're leaving more fish in the water, they're going to provide that ecosystems approach. But I don't see with the uncertainties associated with the ecosystem approach, I don't see us being able to sell that to the public as the reason for being more conservative or less conservative on a particular species. So I have deep concerns about the utility of the ecosystem modeling approaches, and I'm wondering just about how I agree with exactly how you concluded your presentation. When now it's time for the managers to decide. So let's decide and either decide to move forward with this or let's stop and stop spending so much time and effort from our staff on these issues, and talk about the potential of maybe looking more at the Linfest report and maybe being a little more conservative on this fish. Those are my suggestions, Mr. Chairman, but we keep going around and around and around on this issue, and we never have moved forward, and it's been years now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is a great segue for a conversation that I hope we'll have in about 20 minutes. Can you hold that thought, Lewis? Okay. Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jay. This isn't unrelated to the conversation. I see things a little bit differently in terms of getting the managers and stakeholders involved in shaping the ecosystem reference point arena. And the reason I say that is, and I know Jay and others have talked about this, there's an increasing amount of data that are collected, whether it's predator prey, whether it's stomach analysis, however you want to look at that. We do have surveys. We have NEMAP. In the Bay, there's Chest Map. Delaware has a survey. New Jersey has a survey. Everywhere you look, there's survey data. So I really think that before managers, the stakeholders, embark on a qualitative approach to helping determine what ecosystem reference points will be about, since there's going to be a modeling of all this and the right models, I think what's needed is to gather that information. I'm sure that's what the plan is, to start getting the information together, looking what's available, because things have probably changed since 1998 when I went to my first multi-species management workshop in the Bay. And it'd be very good to know really what are the dynamics out there, get the data, go through the model, and then get the feedback on that. So I think it may be a problem to get involved at a manager and stakeholder level, maybe to help guide, but certainly we need to see what the models produce from the data that has been collected. We need to know what other data are necessary. And, I favor more in the interim, instead of jumping from all the way from where we are with single species to ecosystem reference points. I favor some approach of an MSC that Amy mentioned for the biological reference points. I think that'd be really crucial for these ecological reference points. And I also am a big fan of trend analysis. And I know at the Mid-Atlantic Council, part of what's being looked at for forage-based assessments is that the ones you can do, they might be able to be done, but others probably you're going to have to look at the trends in these forage species and use those trends to help still guide single species management. So I guess just some comments that maybe the group has thought about, and I'm sure Jay has thought about all the data, and others have as well, as a key component here.
Yeah, just real quick. I think it gets out what you're talking about, but one idea that was pitched, I know it was definitely pitched to the Management and Science Committee, was I think exactly what you're talking about. So we actually asked if we could pull together, we called it something, but it was a report that does exactly what you're saying, grabs all of these pieces of information, puts them together, I'll use the word dashboard, but puts them into this dashboard type report that can be published probably pretty frequently to this this board. So I just wanted to make sure that that thought gets before this group as well. It may be kicking around some other committee and may eventually get to you, but I've definitely heard this concept come up, and I think it's a great idea, and the committee does as well. So that's definitely something that we're thinking about.
Questions for Jay on the presentation? Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question, Jay, is, and I like the concept of ecosystem-based management, but can we actually do that instead of single species management without prioritizing our species first? If I can expand a little bit, I'll take two of our biggest species here, Menhaden and striped bass. If we find out that we're not getting recruitment in Menhaden because the striped bass are eating them, then are we going to increase the harvest above the threshold on striped bass? Or if we find out we need more Menhaden because the striped bass level isn't high enough, then are we going to have to shut down the Menhaden fishery to get it there to maintain our ecosystem-based? And either way, we're going to fill this room to the point that we won't be able to have the meeting. So do we have to prioritize species first before we can even go forward with ecosystem-based management?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it, what we've advocated here, we came forward, it was a couple years ago with a process called MODA, multi-objective decision analysis. So there is a way to get people's priorities, not necessarily my species better than your species, but all sorts of different priorities, economic, and develop an objective modeling approach to incorporate that information and produce the sort of information we need to then take to that next step and model and simulation test and things like that. So there is work that needs to be done up front for sure. I wouldn't couch it as starkly as picking or prioritizing one species over another. It's more complex than that, but there is a upfront workload that needs to be accomplished first.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Steve is headed where I was thinking, sitting over here, and that is, it's difficult. Even if you do single species management, it seems to me that ERPs for Menhaden are going to be dependent on how much biomass you want to have of all the other species out there that the Commission manages, which are consuming Menhaden, at least to a certain extent. So it seems to me, I don't look at it in terms of species prioritization. I look at it in terms of how much biomass of each one of the Commission species does the Commission and its stakeholders want to have out there. And we had this discussion a long time ago, I think, in terms of what constitutes a quality striped bass fishery. And one of the things that I think the board decided fed into that definition of quality is a broader age structure. And so that was put into Amendment 6 as an objective. And, you know, looking at the board's recent management action on striped bass, it seems that another criterion may be, you know, a biomass higher than we have now, something that approached the peak SSB that we saw a few years back. So is that seems to me that needs to be, if that's the desire of the commission and the striped bass management board, somehow, Jay, doesn't the biomass, the desired biomass level of all these other species need to come into play as well if you're going to establish an ERP for Menhaden? And maybe the same argument could, I presume, be made for Atlantic herring and certainly for shads and river herring. I've always said that I thought maybe, and I understand why striped bass was kind of picked as the poster child species for ASMFC, but in hindsight, maybe we picked, you know, a predator species to manage to a high level of success first when we should have picked a prey species instead, you know, going back and looking at it. But it seems to me you can't do it in isolation. It seems to me, again, not necessarily setting priorities, but maybe set biomass levels for all these other species, and then I don't know what you plug those into to try and see what level then of ecosystem reference points that would generate for Menhaden. And I would suggest maybe you need to look at Atlantic herring and squid and other prey items as well. Am I way off base there, or is that something we need to think about?
Nope, you are not off base at all. You know, it could blow up into a massively complex thing. I think you could also manage it in a smaller, complex system. But I mean, I think I agree with everything that you said. I'll just offer, though, that to get at what that biomass level is, other characteristics, other priorities that people have can be used to figure out what that biomass level is. So we want our party and charter fishery to have X amount of revenue, and so that sort of it's multi-layered. It's not as simple as just picking a biomass. I suppose it could be, but the way we were thinking about it is to encompass more stakeholder and constituent information in some sort of objective way to get at the outputs that you need to then run your models. So again, I think in this case we are talking about striped bass and Menhaden and weakfish and bluefish. It could cascade up from that, but it doesn't necessarily have to.
Further questions for Jay? Keep in mind, I think we're drifting in a little bit to agenda item 5. I want to manage time. So further questions on Jay's presentation? Okay, Jay, again, thank you for a great presentation and for leading us maybe a little prematurely into some great discussion, but we'll come back to it, so thanks. Next, we'll hear from Mike Jones on the peer review panel report. Mike, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, almost evening now, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to give you a hopefully fairly concise report of the review panel that met on the 9th through 11th of December to take a look at the Atlantic Menhaden stock assessment that you've just heard about from Dr. Schuler and Jason. The panel, just for your information, consisted of myself as chair of the panel. I'm an academic at the Quantitative Fisheries Center at Michigan State University and have worked a lot on stock assessments in Great Lakes fisheries and somewhat in the Pacific Northwest. And then I was very fortunate to have as the members of my panel 3 really sharp European stock assessment scientists, quantitative stock assessment scientists, John Simmons from the UK, Carmen Fernandez from Spain, and Anders Nielsen from Denmark, all of whom were appointed by the Center for Independent Experts. And I would be remiss in not mentioning just how incredibly helpful all 3 of them were for the review that we were able to conduct during this period. I probably just contaminated the microphone. Okay, so I'm going to start with a very quick overview of the main conclusions of our panel, and then I'll drill into the terms of reference that we were asked to conform our review under and discuss our findings with respect to those terms of reference. So first and foremost, I'm going to echo something that several of you said when you addressed comments to Dr. Schuler after her presentation. We too were very, very impressed with the thoroughness, the comprehensiveness, and the quality of the stock assessment that we learned about when we reviewed the documents and attended the review panel meeting in December. So overall, bottom line, the panel offered a strong endorsement for both the methods and the findings of the assessment as it was presented to us at that time. We did recommend, as you already know, a minor change to the assessment model, which resulted in the new base run that Dr. Schuler presented today, and I'll talk briefly about what that recommendation was. We also did conclude that the rationale for the proposed new single-species reference points was defensible and justified. And lastly, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, this connects to Jay's presentation, the panel strongly encouraged what I refer to here as a collaborative process to guide the development of ecological reference points, and I'll elaborate on that in a few minutes. So our terms of reference were a little bit different from the terms of reference that Dr. Schuler talked about earlier. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cover each of these, except there was no minority report. All four panel members reached consensus on all of our recommendations, and I'm going to aggregate terms of reference 6 and 7 into a single slide that summarizes some of the key recommendations that we made for research and improvements to the models. So in terms of the assessment data, we generally concluded that the fishery-dependent data were both substantial and used appropriately for the assessment. We had a lot of discussion of the fishery-independent data. As you know, the survey data and the way it's being used is a pretty large change from the previous assessment, and we were of the view that the development of these composite surveys, the 2 adult indices and the juvenile index, were substantial advances over the previous assessments. However, we did identify a concern as we were looking carefully at the model with how the length composition data from the surveys was being used. Again, I'll touch a little bit more on that in a moment. With regards to our assessment of the methods that were used, the statistical catch-at age, or BAM modeling approach that was used for the assessment is very much kind of the accepted practice in fishery assessment these days, and there was nothing that we saw about it that was out of the ordinary. It seemed perfectly appropriate and properly used. But as I alluded to earlier, the one thing that we saw when we looked at all of the hundreds of figures of model results that were presented to us at the panel and in the documents was that when we looked at what the model was estimating the length frequency of Menhaden to be relative to what the observed length frequencies were, the fit was really quite poor. And so we worked sort of interactively, iteratively with the assessment team at the workshop to try alternative strategies for working with those data. And to cut a long story short, we concluded that this approach that Dr. Schuler referred to a little while ago of downweighting the index length frequency data resulted in substantially better model fits. Now, what downweighting means here is that we don't leave the data out, but we allow it statistically to have less influence on how the assessment models are fit to the data than relatively speaking, than other data sources. And so we concluded that a more defensible base assessment model would be one in which the index length frequency data was downweighted somewhat from what was proposed in the report that we looked at. I would summarize this as a very minor change to a very big, complicated statistical catch-at age model, but a change that did make the model fit the data better. We also were impressed by how comprehensive the sensitivity analyses were that the assessment team conducted, the uncertainty analyses, this is what they referred to as the Monte Carlo bootstrap method, and the retrospective analyses. We saw no issues with what they had done. It was pretty darn extensive and certainly informative about the degree to which the conclusions that they reached in the assessment were or were not vulnerable to some of the assumptions that they had to make. So we concluded that generally the methods they used were both appropriate and thorough and led to increased support for the conclusions of the assessment with regards to the stock status relative to both the existing and the proposed reference points. And that was an important conclusion in our opinion. We did make the observation that the uncertainty analysis methods that they were using may in fact be overestimating the magnitude of their uncertainty. This is a little bit of a technical issue, but basically when you do these Monte Carlo methods, if you assume that all of the sources of uncertainty are varying independently of one another, you can exaggerate the magnitude of the uncertainty relative to what you would get if you acknowledge that some of those sources of uncertainty co-vary with one another. So that's arguably good news in that it says that the degree of uncertainty that we might have about the results of the model is actually a little bit less than the assessment report would suggest. In terms of the overall assessment findings, the panel agreed with the assessment team's conclusions that the stock was both not overfished and that overfishing was not occurring, and that this conclusion was true even after making the adjustments to the assessment model recommended by the panel for the new base run, and was true for both the current and the recommended reference points. So I'm largely reiterating what Dr. Schuler presented earlier and just indicating that the panel agreed with their conclusions in that regard. We made one suggestion with regards to the method that is being used to calculate reference points, and that was, or two suggestions I should say, those were to consider using an average F across ages 2 to 4 rather than simply using F at age 2 to reflect the fact that there are two different removal fisheries that have somewhat different selectivity patterns. This is not going to make a big difference to the reference point calculation, but it might be a better sort of acknowledgement of the different fisheries. And then to also, for looking at target reference points, that one might want to consider looking at recent biological trends rather than looking at the entire period of record for defining defining target reference points. The argument here being that in order to decide where you want to be relative to past performance, if there are long-term trends occurring in the productivity of these fish stocks, then the more recent biological data might be more indicative of what you're likely to see in the future than looking over the entire time period. With regards to recommendations for research and modeling, we would like to suggest that the assessment team in the future consider, again, to try to allow for models or to develop assessment models that do allow natural mortality to vary, just based on the simple notion that Menhaden is a prey fish species, and there's not much doubt that predation is a significant source of natural mortality for them, and predation almost certainly varies over time. There are obviously challenges associated with doing that technically, but it stands to reason that you ought to at least try to consider that. We also suggested that in the future the assessment team try to incorporate the methods they use to quantify growth and natural mortality into the assessment models as opposed to doing them external to the assessment models, which is what is currently done. We suggested that they might consider using what's called an age-specific selectivity estimation method rather than a so-called dome-shaped selectivity, still allowing for selectivity to be lower for the older fish, but not forcing it to conform to a particular function. And this is getting more into the ERP discussion, we encourage the assessment team to pursue the development of multi-species models to account for predator-prey dynamics. And importantly, and we've talked about this a couple of times already, is to as soon as possible to try to conduct a management strategy evaluation analysis that could help you to determine future reference points in a arguably more objective and comprehensive way than by relying on historical fishery performance, which is what is being done right now. I would emphasize that these recommendations are much more sort of suggestions for the future than criticisms of the current assessment process. And then my last slide is with regards to the ecological reference points. We already started to have a discussion about this, and so some of what I said is sort of maybe should have been said before that discussion started, but in terms of our deliberations on what we heard about the ERP for Menhaden, we're very much persuaded, based on experience in other ecosystems, that it's really important to continue the discussion and to wrestle with this question of ecosystem or ecological reference points. And that process, as I say here, should or even must be guided by input from stakeholders and managers, specifically with respect to the deliberations on what an appropriate set of objectives and performance measures that are used to judge whether those objectives are being met is defined by the resource users and the decision makers. We encouraged, as Jay indicated in his presentation, the group to focus on ERP analyses that look at indices of predator-prey relative abundances, so looking at how prey dynamics are affected by predator dynamics and vice versa, since this is sort of central to the whole issue of why you might want ecological reference points for Menhaden. And Jay already introduced this term of minimum sufficient complexity. Don't make the models any more complicated than you absolutely have to, because the more complicated you make them, the longer it will take before you have anything that makes sense to you. And then the last point I want to make is that to move forward with the development of ecological reference points, one of the things that we heard both in the report and in the discussions at the review was that the development of ERPs was somewhat held up or constrained by not knowing what the objectives were. And so we wanted to emphasize that while it's really important to have some idea of what the objectives might be and what the performance measures might be, it is not necessary to have agreement on what those objectives are in order to proceed with the analysis that's germane to developing ecological reference points. So the analysts need to know what type of performance measures you as decision makers or stakeholders might use to judge whether a fishery was performing well or not. But they don't need to know which fish matters more than which other fish or things like that, because those questions are, if you devise your ERP process to be constrained by having to determine that at the outset, you're never going to get past the first base or even the home plate, really. But the analysts do need to have some idea of how you would assess the performance of performance of a fishery management strategy with respect to different objectives, so that they can then use their models to help them to define what might be appropriate reference points given those objectives. And I think that's my final point. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Professor Jones, thank you for that great, concise summary of the peer review panel. Thank you as well for your leadership of that peer review panel. By all accounts, you did a marvelous job, so thank you for your professionalism and your conscientiousness and bringing that to us today as well. Questions on the presentation on the peer review panel report for Professor Jones? Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the review committee presentation. I'm wondering if, at a very basic level, a variable M, and it's one of the things that you had pointed out on one of your previous slides, was to have M vary. Isn't that, in a way, taking into account the predator-prey relationships? Because, as abundance of striped bass and bluefish goes up, that's going to increase M on Menhaden. Conversely, I just pick on those two species, there's others as well. Conversely, if striped bass and bluefish abundance is reduced, that's going to reduce M on Menhaden. Or maybe not. Maybe it just opens up the opportunity for other species to increase their predation on Menhaden. Do you have any comments or suggestions on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the reason why M is likely to vary for this species perhaps more than it would for a predator species is because they're vulnerable to the ebb and flow of their predators. And so I think you're entirely correct that the time-varying M, if one were able to estimate it for this fishery, it would almost certainly, or I would predict, that it would reflect the phenomena that are occurring over time with regards to predator demand for Menhaden. Now, whether you're going to get a nice signal by just looking at one or two predator species is kind of a big question, I guess, ecological question, but that would be exactly why I think you would be interested in trying to the process of trying to estimate a time-varying M is almost certainly going to be one in which you're trying to account for the role that predators are playing in influencing survival rates of Menhaden.
Further questions for Dr. Jones? Seeing none, Dr. Jones, again, thank you. Next item on the agenda, looking for a motion to accept the stock assessment report and the peer review report as suitable for management purposes. Dr. Daniel.
So moved.
Motion by Dr. Daniel, second by Mr. Grout. Discussion on the motion. Any Joe? Okay. Dr. Daniel, would you read your motion?
Yeah. Move to accept the stock assessment report and peer review report for management use. You can put Menhaden in there somewhere if you want to. Should be clear.
Motion is to accept the stock assessment report and the peer review report for Atlantic Menhaden as suitable for management. And motion by Dr. Daniel, second by Mr. Grout. Any discussion on that motion? Is there any objection to that motion? Seeing none, that motion passes. I think, Lewis, from I think what I see, there were some questions. Clearly, as we discussed earlier, the TC still has not formally reviewed the results of that peer review. And so I think, we're going to get them together in March during meeting week for the TC to look at that. The board understands that that's where we're headed with this. So without objection, seeing heads nodded. Okay, very good. Next to the last item on the agenda, and Lewis, I may kick it back to you, but I'm going to start, if I may. Agenda item 5: discuss management objectives moving forward based on the results of the benchmark assessment and the ecological reference points, terms of reference. I'd like to thank everyone for a lot of work. A lot of work that's gone on around this board, a lot of work on the part of our technical advisors, a lot of effort on the part of our constituents. This is clearly a big issue. The stock assessment process has worked. We've gotten a clear picture on the status of the stock based on the interim reference points that this board has adopted. And we've gotten a clear picture on the basis of a lot of technical input, some modifications to the models, a lot of cooperation with our stakeholders, and a lot of back and forth with our stakeholders. I see this as a success for collaborative science. And we've arrived at a pivotal moment, I believe. When I first learned of the commission, I read a book by Peter Matheson called Men's Lives, and a lot of the discussions, I look over to my friend Jen Gilmore about the issues related to striped bass. it's been said that striped bass is where the commission really came of age. I believe maybe Menhaden is this generation's striped bass. And so we've got a lot of things, I see our technical advisors begging us for guidance and direction on the future of this fishery, the future of this resource. A lot of people in the audience are stakeholders with a lot of questions that they've got about what we want to do and how we want to manage this resource. So we're at the table. And I think the question before us now is, where do we go and how do we want to move forward? Lewis, I'm going to kick it back to you because you made a comment earlier after a presentation to kick off the discussion, and as commission chair, I think that's appropriate. So if I'll throw you the ball.
Or under the bus.
But I gave you a minute warning, though.
One of the two. I always hate following you anytime I have to speak. I agree with everything you said, and certainly would echo the comments to the peer review panel. Dr. Jones, who's left us, I guess he had to catch a plane, and to Amy, and all the group in Beaufort and throughout the East Coast, and the industry expertise and the participation by the non-governmental groups. Really great. The main concern that I have is, we just had a pretty rough go of this just a couple of years ago. Some things have changed, and now we're all happy again. We don't have folks holding up signs in here today or walking around the room, and that's a good thing. But I don't want to walk out of this room and get hit by a train either. And I would hate to see us move forward too quickly on these results. I think we do need to move forward deliberatively, carefully, take the advice of the technical committee and the peer review panel and provide that guidance that our technical folks need. And what do we really think about these ERPs? I think that's very important, and I think it's something that our technical folks, our advisory folks, the public needs to get it. I mean, Dr. Jones, you said it. I mean, I would, I'm not asking you now, but I would ask, what type of benchmarks, what kind of parameters are you looking for in an ERP? What are you trying to accomplish in an ERP? I hear across the table folks are talking about striped bass and bluefish. I'm thinking bluefin tunas and king mackerel. So it's different up and down the beach, and I think we need to get that perspective from everyone before we move forward. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, I would turn it back to you with the sincere hope that we don't leave this meeting having made any decisions. We don't make any motions to do anything except for moving forward potentially with Amendment 3 to begin developing the next generation's management approach for Atlantic Menhaden.
Discussion. Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I'm seeing things the same way as a chairman. I think in the bait fishery, we're looking at the situation relative to the assessment, and I think a reasonable objective would be to provide a responsible Atlantic Menhaden quota increase when supported by the best available science to support the maintenance of healthy Menhaden fishing communities. For example, I'm not making a motion to that effect. That articulates how we're seeing this situation. A couple years ago, I was at that meeting. I remember all the yellow shirts and so forth. We were all there. It didn't take long to seriously damage the bait fishery for Atlantic Menhaden on the Atlantic coast. And I think the graphs show that with a reduction of from 60 to 40 million, 60 to 40,000 metric tons, somewhere around 30% reduction. The market for bait is not unlimited, but there is significant demand for this fish. And there are concerns about the herring assessment. That blew up, and there may be a reduction in herring landings over the next couple of years, where some proxy for OFL of, some average catch proxy or something will be established. So I think it would be unfortunate for this board not to make a commitment to increase the quotas for the 2015 fishing year across the board. And if I think, as this commission would be bogged down for some undetermined period of time to answer all the questions that have been posed today, both on the board and from members around the table. So we feel very strongly that it's time to move ahead. It's a positive assessment, and I see no reason why in May this board couldn't come together with the projections that have been talked about and at least provide an opportunity to make up what was taken away, as it turns out, without really any need to do so relative to what we now know about the stock status. So thank you for letting me have an opportunity to make that statement.
Kyle.
I concur with that train of thought. I think we've seen here that overfishing has not occurred, and we haven't overfished. We never did. We have moved from the dark ages of yellow shirts and emotion to the light of science. And it is time that we admit that the sky is falling mentality that we had in Baltimore and the couple meetings before that was wrong. And we have people out there that are in desperate need, not now, not tomorrow, but now. And I think this board needs to act. And I don't think we need to go and be rash with this. We have the information. We have the knowledge. Let's take the emotion out. Let's put the science in now that we have full science, full agreement, showing that this stock was not in danger. Now, it could be in danger in the future. I'm not saying that this is something we just go ahead and put it on the back burner and don't look at it like maybe we did 20, 30 years ago. But we certainly shouldn't be where we are today, and I think we have to fix this now. We certainly overreacted 2 years ago, or a year ago, and I think we need an appropriate reaction now to counterbalance that.
Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of comments and possibly a suggestion to move forward here. But the first comment comes with the ecological reference points. Back about 4 years ago, I made the motion to move forward, task the technical committee to develop ecological reference points for us. In the meantime, we were going to have an interim reference point, and that was developed. When I made that motion, my vision for this was that it would be something like a biologically based reference point, which is something we're always striving for with any of the single species management we have. The technical committee came back and said, well, what do you want? What do your constituents want? What do management and constituents want? What are our goals? As someone who was here 3 years ago and is also a chair of the council, the New England Council's Herring Committee, what our constituents want are vastly different. We have very different opinions on what different constituents want and believe is best for the resource and the fishery. That's going to make us giving that kind of suggestion and recommendations of goals and objectives very difficult to come up with, because it's not as if there's a gray area. There's left or right. So I'm actually kind of disappointed. I still vision that there'd be something that would, that from a scientific basis or an ecological basis, that our technical committee could provide us with advice that this is how many menhaden we need to leave in the ocean. Now, it could be anywhere from what a time-varying M is to something more conservative. But the thing we have to take into consideration, and I'm sure they'd have to, is that menhaden isn't the only prey in the ocean. There are multiple preys, and we've seen evidence, at least I've seen some evidence with herring, that when the herring stock went down, there were other prey that came up and took their place. Fish feed on multiple prey here. So I think it's going to be a very difficult and challenging thing if there is not a biological or best scientific estimate of what needs to be left in the ocean for this particular prey. Then it's going to be a very difficult and long process for us to come up with what the board wants and what our constituents want. That being said, there was a recommendation in the near term from our technical committee and from the stock assessment committee that there was some revised reference points that we should consider. And my question is, do we need to, how can we put that into a management action? Can the board simply approve these revised reference points, or do we have to go through a addendum process to implement them? If that's the case, then if we have to do a management action, then that's the first thing we should be working on, is revising the interim reference points to reflect what the most recent available science is. And then we need to move from there in tasking our technical committee to come up with projections of what a sustainable harvest would be under those reference points.
Yeah, Doug, to your question, I think the short answer is yes. That's an addendum process, at a minimum, an addendum or an amendment, depending on how extensive a change that the board would be contemplating. I think the challenge, from my seat, the challenge seems to be these are largely policy questions, and we want a technical solution to a policy question. And my sense of things from hearing the TC report, from hearing the ecological, the BURP report, is that we seem to be bouncing around. We want a technical answer to a policy question. And I don't know that that's the I think this is the appropriate group from where I sit to have those conversations. Once these decisions are made, you take options out via an amendment to the public and say, this is what we're thinking in terms of future management, and then we go through that management process. Mike, Tony, am I on a limb, or is that largely that's correct? Okay. Hold that thought, if we can. Bill Goldsboro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer a comment on possible management objectives, I think is what you're looking for. But first, a couple of comments on some things that have been said. First of all, I disagree with the statement that we overreacted with Amendment 2. If anything, I think we underreacted to the science we had at the time. As as evidence of that, the reference points that are suggested now by this assessment are more conservative than the ones we adopted then. We took timid steps, relatively speaking, at the time, in part because of the great uncertainty we were confronted with in the 2012 update assessment. But with respect to the proposed motion to increase catches immediately, I think we have a very obvious problem in going down that road now, and that is that notwithstanding the fact that this assessment presents us with a much more positive situation than we had 2 years ago, it gives us room to work, if you will, it is still a single species assessment, as has been described and commented on several times already today by our presenters as well as members of the board. So we have some more work to do to determine how much of a buffer, if you will, we need to leave, and that's one way of describing our need to develop and adopt ecological reference points. If anything, in the short term, I don't think we have the ability to increase a coast-wide quota at this time. I can tell you just from a Maryland perspective, admitting that bias, that if anything, the real short-term need as a manager is to address the allocation that we did 2 years ago. I think with hindsight that we underestimated the historical catches in the bait fishery, especially in the small-scale bait fishery, by virtue of having poor catch data. So if anything, I think we need to revisit allocation, and that, of course, is not something you can do very quickly. But from a Maryland perspective, that is important. From the standpoint, though, of management objectives, where you're hoping we will get, I'd like to take off from a comment that was made earlier, a statement that maybe what we need to do is come up with preferred levels of priority species that the Commission manages, and that, of course, is what we did with the MSVPA. We picked 3 of them, and we tried to do that. We're still trying. I would suggest that that's not enough by a long shot, that not only do we have predators managed by this Commission that depend on Menhaden, but we have species managed by this Commission that are alternative prey that are negatively affected by any trophic imbalance that might occur as a result of low Menhaden abundance, which we do see now. One good example that has been brought up in the past by our colleagues from the north is northern lobster, and the concern voiced repeatedly a few years back that striped bass were preying heavily on them, and they, of course, are a very valuable fishery, maybe perhaps our most valuable fishery on the coast. I'll let them speak to that. But then I also want to point out that there are also species that this Commission does not manage that can be affected, either as predators that depend on Menhaden, and Dr. Daniel mentioned a couple of them that we need to pay attention to, but also alternative prey that also might be negatively affected by trophic imbalance. And from a Chesapeake perspective, I'll have to toss out blue crabs in that category. We've had repeated observations and concern expressed by our commercial fishermen for many years now about blue crabs turning up in much higher abundance in striped bass stomachs. And from a Chesapeake perspective, again, the very low recruitment that I mentioned earlier that we're seeing in at least the Maryland part of the bay for Menhaden seems to be linked to that trophic shift. Be that as it may, in addition, having mentioned all those types of species managed by the Commission not managed predators, alternative prey. There are also those that are not managed at all that are very important. And I'll just offer two groups, marine mammals and seabirds, that I think we have a responsibility to address as well. I don't think we have that we can sit back and satisfy ourselves by just paying attention to commission-managed species. And so if we are going to adopt management objectives or ask for evaluation of management objectives or the ecological reference points that might address certain management objectives, I would suggest that the Cadillac, if you will, it would be to maintain adequate forage for all components of the ecosystem. And I don't think that's hard to do. I don't think it has to take a lot of time because, as we've already discussed, there are some less quantitative, more qualitative options that have been thoroughly vetted in the last 10, 12 years or so, and for which we have multiple examples of their successful use in other fisheries around the world. And so I think we have short-term, relatively short-term options for addressing that all-encompassing management objective that we ought to give serious consideration to. I do think we need to get input from stakeholders and managers, and as has been suggested. But to me, that's a very real option, and not to dismiss the possibility of a more quantitative approach, but the MSVPA we started working on the MSVPA, I want to say 13 or 14 years ago, and we still only have 3 predator species. We don't have any alternative prey species. We don't have any non-commission managed species. We don't have any other components of the ecosystem included. So how long would it take to develop a fairly comprehensive quantitative approach? I agree with Dr. Daniel with his concern about the tremendous staff resources that would go into taking that kind of an approach. But as I said, I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. Perhaps we can continue some work on a parallel track, but in the shorter term, consider some of these more comprehensive qualitative approaches. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's amazing what good news brings out of us. On my case, I'd like to just read a little bit from our current Amendment 2. The goal of Amendment 2 is to manage the Atlantic Menhaden fishery in a manner that is biologically, economically, socially, and ecologically sound while protecting the resource and those who benefit from it. So we didn't have the ability to look forward back in 2012. We couldn't magically know what the next assessment would say. But now we're faced with a situation where the social and economic consequences of that amendment have already happened. And I think it's imperative that we, as part of an addendum, if the biological reference points go that way, figure out how we stay on a course to get our fisheries and the needs of our fisheries, not just in Virginia, but in other states as well, back to where they were at a minimum. I saw a lot of gaps with the current reference points or the other reference points and the way the abundance of the stock looks, the way the proxy for the biomass looks. Those gaps tell me that, sure, despite what I said earlier, we can, as managers and stakeholders, have some idea of how much forage and how much fishery we might want in a qualitative sense. The technical committee may even be able to tell us, well, here's what you can expect for forage based on current conditions compared to 2012 conditions or earlier. That could be important. That doesn't have to be an elaborate exercise to do that. I think there are many states. New York was very happy to find out that because New York had situations with harvesters that diligently New York tried to get a hold of, mailed out to, got a very poor response rate, perhaps 4%, I forget what the number was, and was very concerned about the amount of menhaden that was going to be coming into New York that would be problematic. Florida came to us and had a situation where they had a dip net fishery that, again, didn't really have a good quantification of just how many harvesters were there. It was unexpected. I think the board acted the way the board should. There was allowances made. The lobster fishery was very happy to have menhaden shipped. The crab fishery in North Carolina was supplemented. We have to indicate today that Virginia is not going to be the only state this time that is standing alone as it did with its rejection of Amendment 2. So there's lots to say here. I really mean it in a congenial fashion. I think our fisheries are important. I think the sport fisheries are important. I think forage is important. I think all can be accomplished. A full-blown amendment would not be the way to move forward here. I think we can do an addendum, and we should. And recognizing the science, which is important to all of us, I think there is room for the industries and the fisheries to recoup what they have lost. So thank you very much.
Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is a very fascinating situation for us, and it seems like, in my mind, we have three issues that we need to figure out how to deal with, and that first one is as people have said, remembering that the assessment that we have now is single species. There is the cautionary language by the peer review saying, remember, your target may need to be lower if you have unrestricted predator growth. So I think it's important for us, it's time for us to decide how we're going to move this process and make that decision on what we're going to, how we want this fish to look, how we want this fishery to look, and how we're going to deal with forage. And listening to conversations about time-varying M, perhaps it's as simple as, it's probably not, but it could be if M time varies and M is accounting for varying predator pressure on this fish, then maybe we look back and look at when time varying M was quite high, and we try to keep abundance at that level under the assumption that was a time when predation pressure was heavy, and we want to keep that level of fish in the water. I don't know, but we need to figure out, I think, how to move this forward. And in terms of liberalizing based on the assessment results, I think it's really, I would hate to see us have regulatory whiplash. I think our fisheries deserve better than that, and I would hate to say, let's relax this TAC, and then in a year we have some other ecological reference point and we're back in December 2012 all over again. Nobody wants that. But at the same time, to Robert Riley's point, we do have this issue where we need to take into account our fisheries and the economic aspects here. We did commit in Amendment 2, I believe, to reviewing allocation in year 3. I think that we have a overly complicated management for this fishery. We have a New England set aside for 1% of the fishery. We have small-scale bait fisheries that are catching 10% of the total harvest, and maybe not even that. I think there's some ways that we could rejigger things and make sure that we're not damaging our community fisheries, those fisheries that have not been well recorded over time, while we're working out these bigger issues. And in terms of those small-scale fisheries, I looked with interest at what the American Eel Board did. why wouldn't we make a set aside for small capacity fisheries? We'd have to define small capacity, but if they fished at 10%, it would allow us to really understand what these little community fisheries are doing. If we exceed 10%, that sets a trigger to do something more significant, go back to state by state. But the point is, I think there's some creative ways we can get at this. We need to move this forward. We need to figure out that management objective. We need to be careful not to whiplash our fisheries in terms of bouncing from relax, tighten. They deserve some stability, and I think we need to think really hard about the setup of the management overall.
Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And actually, the last three speakers actually made most of my points, so I'll be a lot quicker now. And I just think I'll add to what they all said, and I agree with them. And I think one of the problems maybe that wasn't mentioned was not only the magnitude of what we did, but how fast we did it. And I think that caused a great deal of problems, so that we got into quota management, and we did allocations based on really poor data. And then we started getting problems where it got messy. We're transferring fish around, where Jim Estes and I are going back to our fishermen saying a cast net is not a directed fishery. You don't tell anybody. So it just got to be absurd after a while. So just to the point where I think we all need to reevaluate this and go slowly this time and essentially come up with an approach that's going to fix this long term. And I agree with you, Lynn, not whiplash this, because this roller coaster ride of going up and down doesn't serve anybody. So let's do this right this time. But, if we're going to get into allocations, let's get data and recent data so we can actually put together a plan that makes sense. Thanks.
Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've listened to a lot of the arguments. I was ready to speak earlier when I was going to talk about something. I've had some more conversation that I heard since then. And if I go back to what Doug Grout said, he says there's no gray area, and I believe there is. I mean, we've got harvest levels that are significantly under our current F. And I think that even if we were to have a lower F, we still have room to move that up. And that's what I see as the gray area. We can still be precautionary in increased harvest levels here. And we talk about whiplash from going and starting. The guys that got slammed the brakes on 2 years ago have already got whiplash. And I think we have room to move this up and still be very conservative.
Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're bouncing around here a little, going from increasing catches to biomass and stuff. But I'm wondering back to the point where I think Doug made something about this. Should the technical committee be able to see how much forage abundance there should be out there without getting into, well, I think the striped bass ought to have a quota of this, and the herring have a quota, the weakfish have a quota of this, without getting into that. And I thought there was some chart that did show the biomass level, in other words, how many fish, which we all know how many fish there are in the ocean, that the fish are up there, the catch is down here, and there's more fish sitting in the ocean, swimming in the ocean. And I think that would be helpful if the technical committee could at least start on that thing, since we were getting into this ERP. I, for one, am in favor of raising the catch limits, especially since I'm overjoyed with we're not overfishing and we're not overfished. And I think there is room, as Steve Train had said, that I think there's some room that we can still watch it, but at the same time that we can relax a little bit the catch allowances basically for the fishery without getting into trouble. So I do support somehow we got to look at that and see if we can relax the quotas a little bit on that particular thing. But I think to get started on some statistics on that, I think it would be helpful to see just a number as to what the technical technical committee feels should be the abundance, the forage abundance out there without going into who gets what or what fish gets what. And I think that would be a start to get going on that. Thank you. I'll leave it on that.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Assuming we do go to an addendum, which sounds like we're heading in that direction, just to restate in a different way some of the comments that have been made, I would like to see us pursue the ecological reference points, particularly the simple ones that were recommended by the peer review. I believe it was just looking at relative abundance of predator-prey. When we change the reference points for striped bass, we'll now be managing for a very large striped bass biomass out there. And we had a similar biomass of striped bass maybe in the mid-2000s. Based on the abundance we just saw from the Menhaden abundance seemed to be good then, and we had no limits on the fishery then. So I'd just be curious to see if we do anything, we could at least reassure people that if whatever we decide to do with the harvest level of Menhaden, that we are taking some sort of look at what the impact of the forage base is out there on some of these other species we're managing. Thank you.
Further discussion? Yeah, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my sense is that in listening to this discussion, it's been very compelling. And I sense that we really are at a pivotal stage, as you indicated in your opening comments. And we need to be very careful about proceeding in a direction without knowing where that's going to get us and what our aim is, it seems to me. And as such, it seems to me that this really is a discussion that speaks to an amendment process that takes a fresh look at what we want how we want to manage this fishery. And to just give you a sense of the way I sort of envision an amendment process, it would be going out to the public and getting feedback on the question of, do we want to continue forward managing Menhaden as a single species without regard to their environmental services they provide? That would be option one. We have some new biological reference points that have been offered up to this new assessment. That's a way forward, and that could certainly be one path to be followed. A second would be single species management with regard to the environmental services they provide, that sort of buffering approach that I think has been referred to recognize the role they have as a forage species. And then sort of the third approach would be a true multi-species approach, which I think would be the most complicated, certainly the most progressive, perhaps almost certainly the most challenging. It seems to me that we need to have that discussion. We need stakeholder input on that, and we need to make sure that we're poised and ready to move forward, knowing what it is we're trying to achieve. And then that opens up, once we've determined the direction we want to proceed, in which we want to proceed, it opens up a series of options in terms of how to get there. So my thinking is that this is not an addendum, this is an amendment. This is about rethinking Menhaden based on how we view this species and the role it plays. And that's a long arc, but I think it's a very important arc, and it's probably, at the end of the day, the best way for this board to proceed. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Russ?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I concur with a lot of things that Bob had to say there. I think there is a need for an amendment process, but I also think there's a need for an interim process to get us to where we need to be as far as the resource and the social economic issues that we have. And I think, the technical committee has made some recommendations on targets and thresholds for this species, and maybe there's a time for us to go and move forward that, take it back to the technical committee, have them see what those reference points, what they would produce for a target and a threshold as far as a quota would be. Maybe we work on that in the interim, but we definitely need to move down the path of an amendment somewhere down the road that incorporates everything that has been going on around this board today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Rob.
Thank you for a second chance, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with what Russ has indicated. I was thinking that there's nothing wrong with an amendment since there are some complicated questions, but when it comes to looking at the total allowable landings, that's really not something that's very complicated, and I would think a management objective should be for the technical committee to be able to tell us in May what it would be like to reinstitute those 20% reductions. That's just a start. There are going to be others who want to talk about shifting of things, and that's more for an amendment. But I think that could be done by May. And I also think that along the striped bass story that you started, there's nothing wrong with increments or stepwise. When the ASMFC worked towards Amendment 5, and it came down to 1994 to get ready, at that time, the ASMFC had done two different schemes of quotas. They did a 1995 quota, and they did a 1996 quota. As it turned out, the 1996 quotas never materialized because the ASMFC found out that where they had set the 1995 quotas, that was really where things should be. So similar to that, we certainly can get a step forward with restitution of these total allowable landings and use the amendment process to look further into there, as well as looking at the ecological reference points. My understanding from Amy's conversation earlier in answering questions, she also put up that it would be 3 years before the next assessment update is what I think I saw. And if that's the case, then that gives us time to explore some of the more complicated questions. And the word complex was all about Jay's talk today. I know he must have told us at least a dozen times about the complexity dealing with ecological reference points. So I would think there are two roads we can take. One short-term with an addenda for the total allowable landings and anything else anyone thinks of, but for the more complex situations, that should be an amendment. Thank you.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess what stuck with me was the technical committee's recommendation that the existing reference points are unsustainable. So that's a red flag to me. And I think, quickly going to an addendum and increasing harvest and mortality I think is the wrong way to go, and I agree with the amendment process. Slow it down. Work towards the ecological reference points and get the stakeholder input. So I would not favor going the quick addendum route.
Kyle.
Yeah, if I recall it, really, they were talking about changing the reference points as far as your threshold and your targets, and if they change to the technical committee, we still could fish pre-Amendment 2 levels and not be overfishing and fishing that occurred. So I think tasking the TC with coming up with some levels of fishing that we can do with an array of changing those thresholds and reference points would be a good thing, so we could look at March. And that's the short-term thing. I don't think it's something that's a mystery. I think it can be quantified very easily, and we're still talking about, doing it cautiously, not just going back to 2,000 levels and have a free-for-all. We're talking about, changing some things and bringing back some fish to the industry that maybe we didn't need to restrict.
Further discussion? Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you giving me a second chance here, too. I really agree with what Kyle just said and how he summed it up. I've seen some projections based on the new reference points that were developed outside of this process. They yield extremely robust opportunities, and I agree, we don't need maybe 100% of what the potential is, but there is an opportunity here to restore to these fishing communities what was lost a couple years ago, and I think it would be a mistake. And certainly, maybe we'll get some green or yellow shirts or something like that, but to delay this until all the other issues that are important are resolved would be extremely disappointing to the fishing community who has waited for this assessment, engaged in the process, provided data, and so forth. So I appreciate your comments, Mr. Schick. Thank you.
Lynn?
Thank you also for a second chance. I do think it's worth our time to task the technical committee and to come up with some trade-offs for increases in TAC and see where we wind up. Given their current knowledge of the status of predators and how predators are trending, what are some consequences of bumping up the TAC incrementally? With that said, I also, and at the risk of being redundant, want to say that a relatively substantial increase in TAC for the coast provides very little back to many of the states with these small-scale fisheries. It really is almost, you have to increase a lot on a coastal level to really provide any sort of measurable change to any of these artisanal bait states, including Maryland. And so I would say that I would really like to see the TC do something for us, perhaps break out non-purse seine bait landings. We have the bait sector combined, we have purse seine bait, and we have very small bait fisheries. And what do those small bait fisheries look like relative to the purse seine bait fisheries? Is it appropriate to be putting a small scale fishery on the same scale as a purse seiner? So I just as we explore this increase, I really would like us to think about how we simplify this management that we have and maybe think about a simpler way to accommodate these smaller scale fisheries. Thank you.
Okay. Further discussion? Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to summarize a little bit. I think what I have heard is an approach, a deliberative process that includes us examining potential management options such as status quo with the present fishing regime, rollbacks to the catch controls that were in effect prior to Amendment 2 as a second option, and then a third option that includes the things that we've been talking about at length that we still have some discomfort with, namely what are desirable predator-prey ratios, what is the desired relative abundance of key prey species, and we'd have to look to our technical committee for guidance on those particular topics. So I see us heading in this direction, whether it's via the addendum process or the amendment process. I don't have an opinion on that, but I see us heading in this direction at the next meeting, and I think those are our choices. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. From my seat, what I've heard is want more fish. I've heard others say, not yet. I think I've heard almost unanimous agreement about continuing to investigate within reason these questions of ecological functions, these predator-prey relationships, continuing the decision that the board made with Amendment 2 to manage for ecosystem function. I've heard relief now, and I've also heard comments about regulatory whiplash. I've heard move quickly, and I've heard move slowly. I think and I've also heard a request for the TC to do some projections on the basis of the recommendations from the peer review. And I've heard also, Mike referenced earlier, the AP has not seen or heard these things yet either. So I'm not sure where we go, but may I suggest the following. We got a lot to think about. I think, we're at this pivotal place through a lot of hard work, through a lot of sacrifice by a lot of folks, and we've got some significant decisions to make. I'm sensitive to those communities that are screaming for relief. I recognize that. At the same time, I find myself concerned as well about regulatory whiplash as we seek to get a better handle on this marvelous resource that belongs to all of us and that we are responsible for managing on behalf of the citizens of this country. So I think we can task the TC. They need to convene to review the comments from the peer review. I think we can ask the TC for projections for using these interim reference points and new reference points. And I think we as a board have some questions that we need to ponder between now and May. And if you all will indulge me, I have 3 R's for you to consider. The first is removals. How do we manage removals from this fishery? I think central among that is questions of allocation, which is going to be a tough one. The second R is the remainder. How do we manage the remainder of the fish that are not removed from this system? What are we trying to optimize as a board? These are big questions. For what purposes are we leaving these fish unharvested? Do we have a good handle on that technically? And lastly, and equally important, is a word I call reciprocity. How do we expect our system that we're trying to manage to respond, including these communities that have borne a lot, and a lot, particularly in the last several years? How do we want this system to respond? We're at a pivotal moment. And how do we manage, dare I say, success, or the beginnings of success? Can we think about those things between now and May and be prepared to come back and start to really roll up our sleeves and ask ourselves between now and May to really contemplate these questions? And Bob, I think we'll need a lot of help, staff support. Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, by some of the discussion here, there's some issues concerning menhaden management, both from the point of ER, ecologically based reference points, and some of the current. There's a lot of things that need to be done in an amendment. and that's going to take a long time, and I believe longer than a year. My original concern was we have reference points currently in place that are deemed unsustainable by our technical committee. However, even if we have those high reference points, we don't have to increase the quota all the way up to what those reference points would be. That's still within the purview of the board. So I understand your thoughts about let's take a breather here, let's come back in May, decide whether we want to take the addendum or full amendment route, and also task our technical committee with coming up with a variety of, with some catch advice that would include, at a minimum, what the catch advice would be under their proposed revised reference points. And as I understand it, with my consultation with staff, that this board can change the quotas by a board vote. And we don't have to go through an addendum process or a management process. So this way we can decide whether we want to go addendum amendment and still have the flexibility based on the catch advice we get from the technical committee of deciding whether we're going to move forward with having relaxation of some of the quotas. So I support your let's take a breath here and task the TC recommendation.
Okay, you want to speak to that, Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just follow up on what Doug was saying to confirm that the board does have the flexibility through board action to adjust the TAC, and specifically in the amendment it specifies that they can use all the technical information to do that. And so I don't think that, although formally we don't have whatever the new TC recommendation is as part of our management program because we haven't gone through that addendum process, I still don't think that precludes the board's ability to use that technical information when specifying what the TAC may be.
Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad to hear what Doug said. First of all, whatever you're thinking of putting into an amendment, fine. Thinking about more things that need to be done on that stuff. I'm concerned about the fact that we probably should take a look at relaxing. I'll put it that way, relaxing at least a little bit. What we had come up with for quotas or tax or whatever they are, and what Mike had just said, that it's encouraging to see that we don't have to go through an addendum necessarily to do this. That we could, in fact, if we get the information, we could make a decision on that particular part while we're thinking about the amendment, all the stuff for an amendment, and that would be good if we could do that. Now, what do we need to look at if we were going to change the catch limits? I'll use that word. What do we need? Do we need something from the technical committee to look at? Maybe that's what we have to have in May, and then we'll have some information that we could use if we decide to help out with the catch limits. And so I sort of agree with Doug, and I'm glad to hear about that. You don't have to do an addendum necessarily. Okay, thank you.
Rob.
Yeah, I support Doug's comments, and the one thing, Mr. Chairman, and I'm certainly not going to disagree about this, but I want to make a comment. The regulatory whiplash is something that, since there was a 20% reduction, depending on how the incrementally approach is here, I can't see a whiplash. And for example, in 2004, 4, Amendment 6 for striped bass added some more benefits. The whiplash occurred in 2014. It's something that really I don't see as a problem, especially given what we saw today and what we saw from the stock assessment. So, and thank you, Doug, for your comments.
Lewis.
I hate to mess this up, but I agree with what you said, Mr. Chairman and Doug. One thing I would want us to keep in mind, and this is, I don't want us to get too close to May and have these projections by the technical committee on some kind of an increase in harvest that may be available. With the current allocation, I don't know that that's going to help the bait fishery very much. And that's going to raise a red flag. So I don't want people going home thinking, well, there may be an increase, because I have no problem with an increase, and I recognize the issue with the bait industry, and especially in states like New York where they didn't have good counts on their Menhaden harvest, and the impacts it's had in North Carolina have been significant. But with the current allocation, an increase in quota may not have as substantial an impact on the bait side as we might hope it would. So that's going to require an amendment, as you said, and so I don't know that we'll have an exact, and Mike looks like he wants to correct me, but I just want to make sure that's on the record and that folks are thinking that way between now and May.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the prompt, Lewis. I mean, there's been this discussion about allocation, and I just want to clarify that through the projections, and I could try to work with the technical committee on this, but we wouldn't be looking at that allocation discussion. It would just be what is this total allowable catch for Menhaden. It wouldn't be whether it gets broken down by the bait or the reduction or the recreational catch. It would just be what is the total, and that's what we would come back with for projections to show the board.
Right, and follow up, Mr. Chairman, that's exactly what I mean. And so if you look at the allocation right now, the way it's set up is there would be a certain percentage that would go to the reduction fishery and a certain percentage that would go to the bait fishery, and that I don't think we have the flexibility to change that through just our quota setting opportunities. That was my concern, and if I'm wrong there, you need to correct me.
Yeah, that's the other part that I should have said, that I ended a little early there. So yeah, that state-by-state allocation is how we ended up allocating the TAC through Amendment 2. And so in order to change that, it requires an addendum or an amendment to the FMP. And so that isn't part of the specifications process.
Lynn?
So maybe it would be helpful to get the discussion going a little bit if we did these projections about quota, a coastal TAC increase, and if staff could provide under a TAC increase and under the current allocation what that gives to each jurisdiction, so we can actually see state by state the impacts of each subsequent TAC increase or an interval of TAC increase. Maybe that'll help us kind of start to think more about that future discussion.
Jeff, did you have any?
Yeah, just quickly, I think, from the perspective of New Jersey, an allocation along the lines of, or a quota increase along the lines of what Mike was suggesting is what we're suggesting, I think, not getting involved in reallocations. But if we were to get back to where we were in 2011, that's about a $4 million benefit to the state of New Jersey and to the lobster industry and the crab industry and all the people that we serve as bait producers. It's not just Lund's Fisheries. We're only a percentage of that activity, but it would be an immediate impact economically. It would create jobs. It would extend the season beyond when I think we had to shut down in July last year. The bait demand was tremendous. It's in the middle of the lobster industry. So for all those reasons, I appreciate the direction I think the board is heading in here for our discussions in May very much. And as soon as this meeting's over, I turn back into a civilian. And I guess I'm the AP chair again at that point. And I do hope we can have a face-to-face AP meeting, perhaps perhaps after the March TC week or something like that, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned it earlier, and I appreciate your asking that question or indicating that we could get the AP together. I think it's obviously very important. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Kyle?
Yeah, I do like what Lynn had said. I think, seeing it state by state, and although I'm kind of confused, if we increase or reverse 15% of the 20% cut or 10%, I don't know what would come out of what the TC recommendations of the new target and threshold levels are. But if that's 15%, I think that would be a huge boost to the bait industries and the small industries. So it would be good to see that, and maybe a chart that would be able to do that would be a good thing.
Further discussion? Let me encourage us as we move towards May to recognize there is a lot of work to do, a lot of very, very hard policy questions, certainly some very complicated technical questions as well. I just encourage us all to, when we go back home and talk to folks at home, that we think about these big, big picture questions of this national resource and how we manage it for the future. So thank you. Last item on the agenda. We have recommendations for AP nominations. Mike, are you handling that, or is it? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We received 2 AP nominations from the state of Maryland. The first is for John Dean. He is a commercial pound netter with over 40 years of fishing experience. And the second nomination is David Sikorsky. He has 20-plus years recreational representative from CCA, and he also serves on our striped bass advisory panel. So we have 2 nominations on the board for the Menhaden AP.
2 nominations for the AP. Is there a motion? Mr. Adler.
I'll make a motion to accept the 2 nominees to the advisory panel.
Second by Stephen Train. Further discussion? Joe, do you need that read? Okay. Thank you, Joe. To the Menhaden AP. Thank you, Tony. To the Menhaden AP. Any objection to that motion? Seeing none, that motion carries. Any other business to come before the Menhaden board? Thank you all for a vibrant discussion. Thank you for your time, and look forward to further consideration in May. Bob, we're off the record, Joe. Bob.
Yeah.